Sunny couldn't really treat Ananke to the staples of the waking world cuisine, since he lacked the ingredients. He couldn't even cook up the few classic military dishes, which were mostly based on using synthetic rations in inventive ways. However, he and Nephi still managed to make a delicious meal. They were awakened. After all, and awakened were supreme masters of turning monster meat into all kinds of delightful dishes. In fact, awakened cuisine was as varied as its basic ingredients were limited. There were some fundamental skills taught to everyone, but each citadel and region of the dream realm added its own flavor to the tradition. So, each awakened cook was, in a sense, unique. Take Sunny, for example. His fundamental skills had been taught to him by teacher Julius, since teacher Julius was anchored in Bastion. Sunny's cooking acquired a hint of Bastion's tradition. Later, it was influenced by the flavor passed down to Nephi's by the immortal Flame clan, and then assimilated the improvised habits of the sleepers of the Dark City. After that, he absorbed the local tradition of the Chained Isles, as well as learning this and that from the government awakened in Antarctica, since there was no other awakened whose culinary skills were the result of this exact combination of influences. The flavor of Sunny's cooking was unique. Soon, the chamber was filled with a delicious smell. The meal they prepared wasn't the most visually stunning, but its fragrance was tantalizing. The meat had just the right amount of crust on the outside, while the insides were juicy and moist. It had absorbed the spices and the heat of the coals, becoming tender enough to melt on the tongue. Still, it didn't look too pretty. Awakened didn't really care about the presentation. Since their meals were usually eaten in a hurry while keeping one eye out for the prowling abominations, there were some side dishes. At least, Ananke tasted the dish presented to her with diligently hidden caution, but then, her eyes widened slightly, throwing a quick glance at Sunny and Nephi's. She hesitated for a few moments, and then attacked her food like a hungry wolf. Sunny smiled.
Well, that's better.
It was a far cry from the start of their journey together, when he had to force her to eat even a single small pie. The old woman's appetite wasn't making him worry anymore.
That said, why was she so surprised? Do I not look like a guy who can outcook every damned cook out there?
Sunny grimaced. Well, maybe it was because he was going around boasting about how he had eaten nothing but rotten mimic meat for a month. It was only fair for people to doubt his taste after hearing such things. Still,
I better get Aiko to do the promotions when I open my restaurant, and maybe write me a guide on what I should and shouldn't say.
He could have the shop and the restaurant in the same building. Customers would come to browse the memories, then have a meal to celebrate the purchase, and he would receive the money for both. Chuckling, Sunny focused on his own portion. Soon, they were done with the supper and were preparing to rest. The house of parting consisted of the main ceremonial hall, several smaller halls, and a scattering of rooms for the departing and their close ones to sleep in before saying the final goodbyes. So, Sunny and Nephi's were going to enjoy sleeping on actual beds tonight, for the first time since leaving the siege capital to participate in the Battle of the Black Skull. Before that, however, all three of them remained around the table, drinking tea and savoring its refreshing warmth. Despite the solemn nature of their surroundings, the atmosphere was light and uplifting. It was hard not to enjoy the simple comforts after spending months in the wilderness. Maybe it was this relaxed mood that prompted Sunny to ask the question he had been hesitating to ask for a while. Putting down his cup, he glanced at the old woman and asked,
Ananke, can I ask what rank you're?
She looked at him curiously. My rank? Why, of course. I've reached transcendence not too long ago, my lord. Sunny nodded slowly. He had initially suspected that Ananke was a being of much greater power, but after getting to know her and learning about the fate of Weave, his impression changed. It felt a bit strange to meet an awakened who was 200 years old, but only as powerful as someone like Saint Tyrus, the immortal chain lords notwithstanding. The spell had descended into the waking world only half a century ago, after all, but there were already saints and sovereigns. However, it made sense. The original inhabitants of the Great Realm hadn't been cursed with as cruel a teacher as the nightmare spell. They hadn't benefited from its merciless guidance and the lethal necessity to either ascend or die. Even Ananke, who was a priestess of the spell and bestowed with some of its powers, didn't know anything about nightmares. Without the nightmares, how had the ancient humans even awakened? That was something Sonny had been curious about for a long time. In fact, he knew very little about how the ancient awakened did anything without the spell. He leaned forward a little and asked, his voice full of curiosity.
How does one become transcendent?
Ananke looked at him in surprise and asked if he didn't know. Sonny shook his head.
I do know, of course, how one might transcend in the future, where the nightmare spell controls all these matters, but I don't know how people rose to greater power before.
Nephise pricked her ears as well. The old woman smiled, lingered for a while, and then said thoughtfully, although my knowledge is limited, I will try to explain as best I can. Let's see. The first step is, of course, to awaken. To awaken, one must gain control over their soul essence, and use that control to form the soul core. Sonny blinked and wondered if it was in that order. Ananke didn't seem to understand the question. Naturally, how would one form the core without being able to control essence? It's like trying to build a building without bricks. There are some powerful creatures who are born with their soul cores already formed, sure, and have to learn to move their essence as they mature, but most are born dormant like us humans. She paused for a moment. Learning how to control essence is the hardest part. Forming the core takes time and effort, but as long as you've the knowledge, success is all but guaranteed. Well, some still fail, of course, and die after their souls collapse. Sonny and Nephise glanced at each other. So, the ancient humans awakened in the reverse order compared to modern humans, who formed their soul core after the first nightmare and gained the ability to control essence after surviving the first journey to the dream realm. That was how the spell arranged things.
Oh, interesting.
Nephise took a sip of her tea and asked, her voice tinged with a hint of curiosity.
Then how does one learn to control their essence?
The awakened of the waking world received the ability to sense their essence from the spell. The intuitive knowledge of how to control it was gifted to them. 2. It just took time and practice to turn that control into a practical skill. Most received these gifts after awakening, while Nephise had to catch up after becoming a master. Ananke thought for a few moments.
There's no single way to gain control over your soul essence. In fact, it's a unique experience for many. Some spend long years meditating and perfecting their souls, eventually entering a state of unity between mind and soul. Some attune themselves to the world and gather insights about the nature of living things, traveling from realm to realm. Some follow the teachings of great warriors and train their bodies, testing themselves through hardship and battle. Some even receive sudden epiphanies in a moment of dire crisis with no preparation whatsoever.
She hesitated for a bit.
However, there's a path that anyone can walk, both the simplest and the most dangerous, as well as the most vile.
Sonny raised an eyebrow and asked what that path was. Ananke sighed.
It's to absorb soul essence that has already awakened, through killing those who have already awakened and plundering their soul shards.
Her face turned grim.
The awakened essence already knows how to be controlled, so when it's mixed with the essence of dormant beings, it'll change that essence a little, absorb enough of it, and your essence will awaken. 2. Things were simple during the Age of Heroes, when many corrupted prowled the realms and humans had to battle them to survive. But as the eras changed and there were fewer monsters to kill, some humans and noble creatures turned to killing each other instead.
If you enjoyed this episode, tap the like button and subscribe so you catch the next one. The old woman fell silent. Sonny and Nephise were somber, too. It was too easy to imagine what vile acts those who lusted for power could commit in a world that rewarded murder with strength. In fact, the same vileness could have consumed the waking world, where absorbing the essence of slain humans was easier than hunting down countless nightmare creatures, if not for the government and people like Jet, who maintained order and suppressed the darker side of the awakened society with an iron fist. Things would have turned grim long ago. Legacy clans also played their part, preventing human enclaves in the dream realm from spiraling into lawlessness. Eventually, Sunny sighed and shook his head.
Once your soul essence awakens and you can control it, the next step is to patiently work on forming the soul core. What happens then?
Ananke smiled and pointed to her chest, where the soul core of a human was usually located. Accumulation of power, ascension, is a step of rising above one's mortal nature by improving the quality of their essence, and their body as well. This step can be slow if one refines themselves naturally, or fast, if one improves their essence by absorbing the essence of stronger beings. Once the soul essence reaches a qualitative change, the soul core will reform itself and grow stronger. As well, of course, it won't happen without some conscious refinement, either. Sunny tilted his head.
How does one refine their essence, exactly?
Ananke laughed.
It's not something I can explain in one conversation. There are methods and techniques, the knowledge of which has been accumulated over countless generations and is taught to disciples over many years. Even then, very few manage to succeed, of course. All those who do succeed have to find the way into their soul sea first. Without the ability to enter the soul sea, it would take one many lifetimes to ascend even with the best refinement technique.
She shook her head with a smile.
At least that's how it's for us humans. Some of the noble creatures have their own ways. They can possess multiple soul cores as well and walk the path of ascension more naturally.
Sunny blinked a couple of times.
People have to learn how to enter their soul seas.
The old woman nodded matter-of-factly. Sunny admitted that it was unexpected.
Of course, that's without the guidance of the nightmare spell. Weaver gave us mortals a gift that can hasten each step on the path of ascension, including the discovery of one's soul sea.
Everyone just assumed that being able to access the soul sea was a natural ability of all awakened, including sleepers. As it turned out, that was another thing that the spell had simplified for the humans of the waking world.
Ruthless, relentless, and immensely effective. That's how the spell is.
The more Sunny learned about the nightmare spell, the more he realized how ingenious and cruelly effective it was in helping, forcing people to become stronger, stronger, and stronger still, until they either rose as high as they could and higher than that, or died. For what purpose? He didn't know. Nephi sighed. Ananke nodded. Sunny asked about transcendence.
Transcendence is different. It's not just about accumulation. It's a step of profound transformation, where a mortal assumes the first qualities of the divine. The soul essence has to become much more potent. The soul core has to become much more voluminous. Most importantly, an awakened has to become one with the world and be recognized by it. Their soul has to be expanded beyond the confines of the body and fused, to a small extent, with the world. Hard to explain with words, forgive me.
Sunny tilted his head, thinking. Ananke's words did indeed sound very vague and esoteric, but he felt that he understood what she was talking about. It was like when Saint Tyrus appeared and the sunlight seemed to shift a little, as if wishing to be close to her. The world itself responded to the transcendent, and even bent to their will sometimes. Then again, it also responded to a few people below the transcendent rank, like Nephi's or Jet or Sunny himself. That was peculiar. Ananke took a sip of tea and added, her voice bright.
Of course, the connection between a transcendent and the world isn't all-encompassing. Rather, it's a connection to one or very rarely several aspects of the world, be it water, wind, shadow, light, or something else entirely, and therefore, the most important step an ascended human has to take to achieve transcendence is to awaken their aspect.
Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other in confusion.
Awaken their aspect, what do you mean?
The old woman coughed. But that's exactly what I mean. That one must possess an aspect to transcend. Sunny massaged his temples.
Wait, don't all awakened possess an aspect?
Ananke chuckled. Of course not. Every awakened human possesses the potential to realize an aspect, but there are plenty of those who never do, maybe even most. However, the higher you rise on the path of ascension, the harder it becomes to move further without claiming your aspect. As well as your flaw, it's impossible to transcend without them. That information was truly shocking. Neither Sunny nor Nephi's could digest it quickly, awakened without aspects. There was such a thing. Sunny tried to remember every human he had fought in the first and second nightmares. Had all of them shown aspect abilities? He really couldn't remember, or rather, he couldn't tell based on his memories. Nephi's, meanwhile, frowned and asked, her voice full of contemplation.
Why is it that only humans possess aspects? Why don't creatures, noble creatures, have them as well?
To the humans of the waking world, everything that wasn't a human was a nightmare creature. But, of course, Sunny had learned a long time ago that this wasn't the case. There were humans and there were creatures, like the original saint or nightmare. It was only after they succumbed to corruption did the noble creatures, as Ananke called such beings, become abominations. The problem was that there were only humans in the waking world, while every creature in the dream realm was already corrupted. That was why the concept of something that wasn't human, but also not abominable, was hard to accept. However, in the ancient times, humans and noble creatures lived side by side. Nevertheless, their difference between them was the same. Humans could only rise in rank but possessed aspects, while noble creatures rose both in rank and class, but had no aspects of their own. So, the question Nephi's asked was indeed interesting. Ananke smiled.
Why, it's because noble creatures were created by the gods while we humans weren't.
Sunny blinked, confused by the letter. He did know that creating living things was an authority exclusive to the gods, which was why Nether's feat of making saint and her people was so remarkable. Now, he learned that all creatures were the result of the gods exercising that authority. But what did Ananke mean when she said that humans weren't made the same way? Noticing their confusion, she chuckled.
Humans weren't created by anyone, and instead just appeared from the same stuff the gods were born from. It's just that, if the gods were the flame, then we humans were tiny sparks that shot out as the bonfire was dying out. Nevertheless, we come from the same source, which is why all humans possess the potential to become divine, as well as the ability to awaken an aspect, why the path of ascension is open to us.
Sunny frowned.
There was an ever-changing void where desire was born, from it came direction and the gods.
He still didn't really understand the meaning of these mysterious words, but if Ananke was telling the truth, and not just retelling baseless myths, humans came from the desire and direction as well, just as the gods had. He shook his head.
All right, I can understand that, but why did you say that it's not only an aspect that's required to transcend, but also the flaw?
The old woman sighed, because one can't exist without the other. Imperfection is also an absolute law, just like death, and so nothing is flawless. Even the world itself is flawed. Even the gods, who were born flawless, aren't perfect anymore, and so we humans are flawed too. She smiled and added, her voice calm. But that's a good thing. Flawless things are perfect, and so they can never improve, they can never grow, they can only remain still and unchanging, which is no different from being dead. Being flawed is the essence of life. My lord and lady, it's also the essence of growth. After all, what's life if not a constant struggle to grow and improve? Sunny almost choked on his tea. He had grown accustomed to Ananke being helpful and accommodating, so he didn't expect her to become philosophical all of a sudden. Worse still, because of his own flaw, he had no chance but to answer her philosophical question, which was simply, what's life? He coughed.
Well, I don't know. To me, life is all about being rich and comfortable. Throw a little decadence in the mix, and it's even better. If I ever manage to build such a delightful life for myself, I'll be more than happy to never improve or grow, apart from growing fatter, that's.
The old woman laughed. That's a remarkable dream, my lord. Nephi's threw a burning gaze at him at the mention of decadence, then turned to Ananke.
Then what about the next step? How does one become supreme?
Her voice was tense. The old woman lingered for a while, then shook her head with a sigh. That I don't know, and there's no one left to teach me. I am sorry that I can't be of help. Sunny shook his head.
No, you've already been very helpful. We learned a lot from you.
Ananke smiled. "In that case, thank you for this meal, my lord and lady. I've been blessed by your grace. Rest well tonight." She rose and added, her voice tinged with melancholy, "Tomorrow, we sail to the center of the city." After she left, Sunny and Nephis remained silent for a while. Both were thoughtful, pondering the startling truths of how the ancient humans walked the path of ascension before the nightmare spell. Eventually, Sunny sighed.
It seems that awakening took a lot longer before, but wasn't nearly as fatal as it's with the nightmare spell.
Nephis nodded silently. He scratched the back of his head and added,
I am more curious about something else, though. If it's possible to awaken without the help of the spell, then why has no one accomplished just that in the waking world? Why were there no awakened in our history?
She frowned.
Maybe it's because the waking world has nothing to do with the dream realm and functioned according to a different set of laws. Or maybe there were awakened in our history, but their stories have become mere myths.
Nephis shook her head and added, her voice uncertain,
It would also not be surprising if the possibility was there, but no one has ever managed to grasp it. After all steps except the first one, gaining the ability to sense your essence, require some kind of knowledge. Forming the core, refining essence, expanding the soul. You wouldn't be able to do it blindly. For the ancient humans of the dream realm, it wasn't too hard to gain that knowledge. All they had to do was observe the awakened creatures, or learn directly from one of the deities.
Sunny nodded.
But those deities are all long dead. There were only humans in the waking world, and so they had no one to learn from and no one to show them that there was something to be learned. Yes, it's a good theory. The theory that our world is simply different from the dream realm is also good, as well as that there were actually a few awakened in history. They're all good theories. Which one do you think is the correct one?
Nephis lingered before answering. After a while, she sighed.
There's no way to tell. We still know too little about the dream realm. We also don't know how the nightmare spell infected our world, and why. But personally, I don't buy that there has always been a connection between the two. If so, then why is the waking world so isolated, so unique, so singular?
She shook her head.
Why are there no similarities in the languages, the myths, the traditions? Why has there never been an awakened creature on Earth before the nightmare spell? No soul shards, no sorcery, no aspects, and no flaws. Why was there no corruption?
Sunny remained silent for a while, thinking. Then, he said tentatively,
Maybe it was created as a sanctuary or an ark. If so, then perhaps it's precisely because there were no awakened, no soul shards, no sorcery, and no aspects, that there was no corruption.
He shrugged with a sigh.
As for the languages and myths, I don't know. To be honest, I don't really believe in that sanctuary stuff. I just said what came to mind. You're right, our world is the only place that was drastically different from the dream realm before the nightmare spell infected it. We don't know anything about anything, so how would we know the reason why?
Sunny shook his head and rose to wash the dishes.
In any case, I'm tired and it's time to rest. Where are you going to sleep?
Nephis gave him a long look.
Is there a particular reason you're asking?
Hearing that, he almost dropped the dirty plates.
What? I just want to know which room you chose to pick a different one.
He huffed, glanced at her, and grinned.
Though.
But Nephis was already standing up.
Good night.
A few moments later, she was gone. Sunny remained standing for a while, alone in the empty chamber. Eventually, he sighed.
How come I am the only one doing dishes?
Look! The ketch was flying across the water, its sails full of wind. Sunny was standing at the bow, staring into the distance curiously. Nephis was a few steps back, sitting on the deck with her eyes closed, hearing his voice. She opened them and looked ahead. There, a floating city was slowly appearing from beyond the horizon. Weave. It was much larger than Sunny had imagined, with countless artificial islands connected together to form a single whole. There was a network of canals between the various districts that served as roads, and a forest of narrow towers rising into the sky. Most of them were wind catchers, just like the tower of the House of Parting was. Some blades still rotated, some were broken and still. Torn scarlet fabric fluttered in the wind. The architecture of Weave was varied, airy, and beautiful. Some buildings were constructed out of stone, some seemed to be carved of ivory, some were pavilions of sun-bleached. Bright silk, there were districts with homes and houses, groves of fruit trees, and even entire city-ships taken entirely by a single elegant palace or a solemn temple, some distance away from the residential districts. Separated from them by a wide stretch of water, were vast floating fields and gardens, bathed in the light of the seven suns. The floating city was strange and fantastical. However, neither Sunny nor Nephis were enchanted by its dreamlike beauty, because, above all else, Weave seemed eerie and forlorn. The tall windcatchers were still or broken. The streets and canals were empty with no soul in sight. The groves were overgrown and wild, while the fields were desolate and empty. Some city ships were drifting apart, their mechanisms broken, while others were tilted and partially submerged in water. It was a ghost town. Strangely, though, while some buildings bore scars or had collapsed, most were intact. This wasn't the picture of destruction and devastation that they had imagined. "Welcome to Weave, my lord and lady." Ananke's voice sounded slightly mournful. Sunny agreed right. It also sounded very different from before. There had been a time when her voice was weak and creaky, like dry wood. Now it was bright and melodious like a clear stream. Sunny still felt rather strange when talking to the current Ananke, the old priestess. No, he couldn't even call her that anymore, because Ananke wasn't old anymore. Turning around, he looked at the young woman steering the ketch. She seemed only a few years older than Sunny and Nephis, if any. More than that, she was exquisitely beautiful, with her small stature and glistening ebony hair, dusky skin and piercing blue eyes. Ananke looked like an enchanting river spirit. Her lovely face was lively and captivating, and her disarming smile was bright enough to illuminate the world.
It's weird.
Sunny was deeply uncomfortable for the last couple of days because of how young Ananke had become. On top of that, despite being 10 times his age, she seemed too earnest and even slightly naive. That was the person he had been calling grandmother. With a sigh, Sunny tried to shake off the feeling of incongruity and asked in a strange tone,
Haven't you told us that Weave was destroyed, Ananke? It doesn't seem damaged that terribly.
The young priestess remained silent for a while, then answered with a sad smile. "There's more than one way to destroy a city, my lord." With that, she moved the steering oar and sent the ketch flying toward the central district of the eerie city of Weave, where only the wind disrupted the ghostly silence and emptiness permeated desolate streets. Soon, they slowed down and entered one of the canals. Ananke whispered a few words and the sails lowered themselves. Summoning her long harpoon, she stood up and used it as a pole to push the ketch forward as it traveled deeper into the heart of the city. Sunny and Nephis silently watched the districts that floated past. Indeed, there were no living beings here, at least none that they could see. Nephis shifted slightly.
You said that Weave was devastated by a Defiled. Is that NDN-ND3DN still here?
Ananke slowly shook her head. "No, but I've been absent for a long time. An abomination or two could have crawled out of the river to make a nest among the ruins. It's better to be careful." Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other and silently summoned their weapons.
Just what the hell has happened here?
Eventually, the ketch reached an intersection of 2 wide canals. Ananke allowed it to drift for a dozen meters, then stopped at a small platform. There were stone steps leading from the platform to one of the central districts of the city, and after roping the ketch to a post, she lightly jumped down, together. The 3 of them ascended the stairs and entered a wide plaza. It was desolate and partially submerged in water, with scars on the collapsed buildings hinting at a fearsome battle that must have taken place here a long time ago. Ananke, who had been strangely reluctant to answer their questions before, finally sighed and turned to face them. "The Defiled that destroyed Weave visited us almost half a century ago. However, the city didn't die until a few decades after that." Both Sunny and Nephis looked at her in confusion. How could a city be destroyed decades after it was attacked? The young priestess remained silent for a while, then gestured to the drowned plaza. "This is where the battle ended, and the slaughter started. I've told you before that outsiders are vital to the existence of the river people. They're the oldest and most powerful among us. They're also the only ones who can travel unimpeded across the river. Without them, the cities would become completely isolated from each other. Well, that doesn't really apply to this city of exiles, since we were always on our own. She looked down, but since Weave is located close to the desolate future, we had to constantly defend ourselves from powerful corrupted. The elders were the only ones who could pursue and eradicate them. Otherwise, those horrid creatures could come and go as they pleased, retreating when wounded to attack again, and again, and again. So, that was how the Defiled destroyed our city. Ananke gazed at the drowned plaza with a grim expression. He simply killed every outsider in Weave. After the elders were gone, the rest of us were slowly driven to extinction. Some died fighting the corrupted, some succumbed to sorrow and despair. The less of us there were, the harder it was to keep those who remained alive. A blow after blow, a disaster after disaster. Eventually, despite all my efforts, Weave was no more. The young priestess took a deep breath and turned to them with a sad smile. The ships and the buildings remain, but without the people, they're just an empty shell. She took a deep breath. My lord, my lady, I told you that we must come here to gather supplies, but that wasn't entirely true, to be honest. I just wanted you to see Weave at least once, so that someone would remember it, remember us, even when the ships and the buildings are gone, too. Sunny felt his chest becoming heavy, but Nephi's seemed to be affected more. Her face was motionless as usual, but there was a hint of darkness in her eyes. Taking a step forward, she placed her hand on Ananke's shoulder and gently squeezed it. She must have seen herself in the young priestess, the priestess of the nightmare spell. In a city built by the followers of Weaver, that title must have carried incredible weight. It was very likely that Ananke had suddenly become the ruler of the decimated Weave after all the elders were slaughtered by the Defiled, only to see it wither and die, no matter how hard she fought to save it. Just like Nephi's had watched the village she built be swallowed by the darkness in the second nightmare, until she was the only one left alive. Just like Nephi's had been the only one to survive. Ananke patted Neph's hand and smiled. It's all right, my lady. It happened a long time ago. Anyway, the corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. Looking away, he asked in a perfectly even tone if he was going to kill that bastard.
That Defiled, he must have been strong. If the outsiders were the most powerful among you, then not just any creature could have killed them all. Still, just in case I get a chance to meet him one day, is there a way I can recognize him?
The young woman lingered for a while, then sighed. Yes, my lord, it wasn't just any Defiled. Indeed, the one who came to Weave is infamous enough that even we had heard of him. It was the Mad Prince. He frowned and asked if she meant the Mad Prince. Ananke nodded. He's called Mad Prince, or the Prince of Madness. That fiend is one of the 6 plagues. She shivered and looked away, as if suddenly uneasy. The 6 plagues aren't the most powerful of the Defiled, and neither are they the most ancient. However, they're the most feared and loathsome: Mad Prince, Soul Stealer, Undying Slaughter, Torment, Devouring Beast, and the most harrowing of them all, the Dread Lord. Everyone on the Great River has heard their names. They're also called the Heralds of the Estuary, sometimes. The young priestess frowned. Some even say that the Dread Lord is the true ruler of Verge, and that all Defiled submit to his commands. If so, maybe he was the one who sent the Mad Prince to Weave. I doubt it, though I am not sure if that thing can be controlled by anyone, so he must have come of his own accord. Nephi's, who had been listening silently for a while, suddenly asked in a steady tone.
The Dread Lord is said to be the ruler of defilement. What about the first Seeker? What power do he and the other 5 plagues possess? What rank and class are they?
Ananke smiled helplessly.
I am sorry, my lady, Weave is far away from the other human cities, so whatever news used to reach us was vague and fragmentary. The first Seeker, no one had seen him in a long, long time. Some say that he has turned into a mindless mass of rotting flesh because of the defilement. Some say that he was severely wounded by the Serpent King and is yet to recover. Some say that the Dread Lord has subjugated and imprisoned him.
She lingered.
As for the 6 plagues, we knew very little of them. The Soul Stealer is said to possess the ability to wear the skin of those he kills. The devouring beast is immensely ferocious and feeds on human flesh. Torment is known for subjecting her victims to harrowing torture. Undying Slaughter is eternally consumed by insatiable bloodlust. The Dread Lord, no one has ever survived facing him, so his powers are unknown.
The young priestess smiled bitterly.
I can tell you about the Mad Prince, though he's a raving lunatic who seems to be as murderous as he's tormented by his own madness. He looks human, or at least human-shaped. His clothes are tattered, and his face is a mass of scars, which look to have been inflicted by his own nails. He's said to wear a tarnished crown, but I haven't seen it myself. At first glance, he appears rather pitiful. However, beneath that ragged surface hides a vile and hateful monster.
She gritted her teeth and looked at the scarred buildings surrounding the plaza.
His powers are that of a sword saint, but his swordsmanship is as mad as he's himself. It's violent and utterly chaotic, yet cruel and savagely lethal. He finds joy in tormenting his victims, then grows indifferent to their pain the next moment. The most terrifying thing about him, though, is that his madness spreads like a disease. Other than that, perhaps I didn't even get to see his true power. He tore our elders apart with just his blade, as if they were weak children.
Nephis glanced at her own sword, then asked somberly what his rank and class were. Ananke lowered her head.
It was hard to tell. He's of the corrupted rank, I think. As for his class, I am almost certain that he's a Titan.
A corrupted Titan. Sonny's face grew dark. The memories of Falcon Scott flashed in his mind, bringing with them a bitter taste. It was another city that had been destroyed by a corrupted Titan. Even if the scale and swiftness of destruction was different, he remained silent for a few moments, then asked quietly,
Aren't Titans usually huge?
Ananke hesitated, then shrugged. Her azure eyes were crestfallen. Most are, but some aren't. More than that, the Defiled, they were humans once. Their path to profane power is unique. He nodded, feeling a deep sense of unease. A corrupted Titan. If one of these 6 plagues was indeed as powerful as the Winter Beast, then just how terrifying the Dread Lord would be. Still, Sonny felt a dark and scathing desire to kill that Mad Prince. It was strange, really. He had met all kinds of horrid nightmare creatures, but knowing that the Mad Butcher who destroyed Weave had been a human once filled him with dark wrath.
Just how low can a person fall?
Odious, the Mad Prince, whoever he had been before succumbing to corruption, was simply odious. Such a vile creature had no right to exist. Sonny gritted his teeth, thinking about how many of the abominations he had slain in the past were former humans as well. After thousands of years of corruption, the distinction was all but erased. But here in the nightmare, it felt different. Nephis, meanwhile, had another question. Looking at the forlorn vista of Weave with a frown, she hesitated for a few moments, then asked softly,
Ananke, you said that the outsiders were the most powerful warriors of your city. The Mad Prince easily killed them all. Wouldn't that mean that he could have killed all the Riverborn as well? Why did he spare you?
Sonny grimaced. He was asking himself the same questions, but didn't want to speak it aloud in fear of hurting the young priestess more than she had already been hurt. Ananke remained silent for a while, her head lowered. Eventually, she took a breath and said quietly, Maybe he wanted us to suffer longer. Maybe he needed us to live some more. For whatever reason, maybe he simply didn't care. The Riverborn, he did kill some. However, then, he stayed his sword and kneeled in front of the girl he spared. She was a child who had just recently arrived from the House of Youth. He asked her a question, then left. Sonny and Nephis looked at each other somberly. She asked what the Defiled had asked. The young priestess lingered, then slowly shook her head. He asked her, Do you wish to live? She said that she did. Hearing that, the Mad Prince burst into laughter, wiped his bloody sword on her tunic, and disappeared. He never returned, and since all our elders were dead, we never heard about him again. Sonny frowned, remembering the piece of flotsam that he had drifted on for the first couple of days in the nightmare. It was a tenuous connection at best. But why had the Mad Prince asked the girl what she wished? Was he, perhaps, the lunatic who had carved the frantic runes into the ancient wood. If so, then maybe the 6 plagues had already become 5. Considering that the piece of flotsam had seemed like a fragment of a destroyed vessel, the defiled titan might have perished in a battle with one of the harrowing nightmare creatures upstream. Sunny called the mad prince an insane bastard. That said, there was a very troubling thing about connecting Sunny's improvised raft to one of the defiled from Verge. There were letters of the waking world alphabet among the runes. 2. How the hell would Mad Prince know them? It was all too eerie and mysterious, and he breathed a word of damnation, shaking his head. Sunny took one last glance at the drowned square. The fierce battle that had taken place here must have fractured the foundation of the artificial island, which was why it became flooded. He sighed and turned to Ananke.
We still have to gather supplies, right?
She nodded. Sunny pulled the young woman away from the square and said in a soft voice,
Then show us around Weave. We can get them on the way.
Ananke smiled a little, while Nephise threw him a grateful glance over her shoulder.
If Ananke wants us to remember her city, then it's the least we can do. I'll make sure to write a detailed research paper after returning to Northern Quadrant Siege Capital, so that everyone in the waking world could learn about it, too.
Sunny smiled.
You know, Ananke, I'm a well-respected professor in the future.
She looked at him with a hint of confusion in her azure eyes, asking if he was a professor. He nodded.
A teacher, I teach young awakened how to survive and provide for themselves in the wilderness, at the most famous academy in the world, no less. However, our knowledge of the intricacies of surviving in marine environments isn't that extensive. I am sure I will gain a lot from learning about Weave. Then I'll be able to teach my students about it. As well, they'll be thanking me with tears in their eyes.
The young priestess seemed more confused than touched. Sunny frowned. She shook her head slightly. Sunny asked what it was. No, it's nothing. But, my lord, aren't you a food merchant in the future? How can you also be a teacher? The corner of Sunny's mouth twitched. He remained silent for a few moments, then answered stoically.
Learned people also have to eat, don't they? That's just how great I am, respected academic, renowned warrior, accomplished military commander, thriving entrepreneur. I am the picture of a perfect gentleman.
Ananke looked at him, then nodded with bright sparks in her azure eyes. My lord is amazing. As Sunny grinned, Nephise added under her breath that he was also very modest. His grin dimmed, but only for a moment, nodding energetically. Sunny agreed.
Indeed, amazing is a word that can be used to describe me.
They traveled across Weave to collect everything needed for the long journey ahead, even after long years of being abandoned. The city still seemed to be in a relatively good shape. However, beneath the beautiful surface, it had already started to crumble. Sunny knew that Weave wasn't going to exist for much longer, maybe in a decade or 2. The floating city was going to break apart and be swallowed by the currents of the great river, disappearing forever under the waves. Before it did, they gathered fruit from the wild groves and other supplies from various caches that Ananke had established throughout the city. There was food, spices, wine, tea leaves, and necessities that one would need to travel the great river. There were items. As well, the weapons and armor that the people of Weave had crafted and used were of inferior quality to the powerful memories that Sunny and Nephise wielded, but they were able to collect a lot of things that would make traversing the tomb of Ariel easier. From simple blankets and cutlery to fishing nets sturdy enough to capture nightmare creatures and sail repair kits, everything went into the covetous coffer as they moved from one district to another. Ananke also shared stories of Weave and its people with them, how they lived, what rituals they observed, what passions drove them, and what vices they sometimes succumbed to. There were interesting details about the everyday lives of the river people and entertaining anecdotes. Sunny really learned a lot from hearing these stories, and the more he learned, the more amazed he became. Their world was so different from anything he knew, and so they had adapted to its strange circumstances with the tenacious ingenuity inherent to all humans. Their knowledge of how to survive on the great river had been built over many generations of persistent, relentless learning and unceasing improvement. Humans were the most adaptable of species, indeed. When Ananke started to tell them about Weave, There was a shadow of sadness in her eyes. However, as she remembered the people from her past, they gradually grew bright and warm. A sweet smile appeared on her lips. But the more the young priestess spoke, the more despondent Sunny became. He hid his expression and stared at the empty streets of the desolate city, his own eyes veiled by somber darkness. Ananke had been nothing but kind to them, so it was unfair. Sunny and Nephis were going to leave Weave to travel into the distant past and challenge the nightmare, but she could never leave, because she was riverborn after guiding the two of them as far as she could. The young priestess was going to return to the crumbling city and live the rest of her life here, alone and forsaken. Sunny's heart was heavy, and his hatred of the mad prince burned darker. He cursed the vile bastard. Looking away, he gritted his teeth. Consumed by despondence, Sunny tried to find solace in anger, but it was of no use. Then, Sunny tried to remind himself that the Ananke he knew was just an apparition conjured by the spell. The real Ananke, the true priestess of the nightmare spell who had lived in the real tomb of Ariel, was long dead, her spirit and bones taken by the great river. She had never met Sunny and Nephis. She had never traveled to the far reaches of the future or made delicious small pies for two complete strangers. In fact, it wasn't at all clear if the real Ananke shared the same fate as the one he knew. The Serpent King had brought many challengers into the nightmare. After all, their actions had to have changed the flow of events within this version of the tomb of Ariel. Perhaps the real Weave was never destroyed by one of the 6 plagues, or had been wiped out entirely long before Ananke was born. But telling himself that Ananke wasn't real didn't help either. It never did, be it the first nightmare, the second, or the third. Sunny couldn't help but treat the people he met as real. With a heavy sigh, he turned to look at the magnificent structure they were approaching. It was an unusual one, much larger than most buildings in Weave. It was situated in the very heart of the city, on a solitary island ship that floated some distance away from the rest. The artificial island was connected to the neighboring ones with rope bridges of white silk, resembling a spider sitting at the center of a vast web. The structure itself was tall and imposing. Built of roughly cut black stone, tattered white banners were hanging from its walls, fluttering in the wind. It looked nebulous and sinister, like a temple of some dark deity. Sunny had an idea who that deity was. Looking up, he saw a lonely figure standing on the roof of the numinous temple, looking down at the desolate ruin of Weave. The black silk of its long hair and tunic remained motionless despite the strong wind. He couldn't see the figure's face from the distance, but silhouetted against the azure sky, it seemed strangely grim. Sunny noted that he was there. The sin of Solace had finally shown himself after hiding somewhere for a long time, and yet the Wraith was simply observing the ghost city from above instead of tormenting Sunny with snide remarks. Its behavior had been getting stranger and stranger ever since the start of the nightmare.
Well, good, stay away for as long as you want, you won't be missed.
Paying attention to the apparition through one of the shadows, Sunny followed Ananke across one of the rope bridges as they got closer to the ominous temple. Sunny and Nephis felt a strong sense of unease. However, the young priestess looked unperturbed. If anything, her expression grew calmer. This is the last place we will visit in Weave. Even her voice sounded lighter. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then asked in a somewhat stifled tone if this was the Temple of Weaver. Ananke shook her head with a faint smile. No, my lord, Weaver was elusive and had no desire to be worshipped. It's useless to worship the demon of fate. Anyway, no matter how virtuous you're and how many offerings you make, fate will always remain uncaring, unchanged, and inevitable. She pointed to this dark temple. No, this is the temple of the nightmare spell, of the gift Weaver has given us to rely on instead of the gods, the demons, and of fate itself. Sunny was once again faced with the fact the demon of fate seemed to have created the spell to resist the very thing that was supposed to be the source of their power, which was of fate itself.
Maybe Weaver was bound by the chains of fate, just like I'm bound by them too.
The sudden thought was both ominous and chilling. If even the demon of fate hadn't been able to escape its clutches, then how could Sunny ever hope to succeed where Weaver had failed? Still, despite everything that had happened, he still wanted to be free. That primal desire was rooted deep within his soul, smoldering, too vast and searing to be put out by shallow things like knowledge or wisdom. Even though Sunny had learned that there was no such thing as true freedom, at least not without sacrificing everything one held dear, he still stubbornly clung to the desperate wish of breaking free of his bonds. It was just that the tumultuous twists and turns of his strange life had dampened that fiery hope a little. He sighed, then glanced at Nephi's with a guarded expression. She wasn't going to do something extreme like burning the temple of the spell down, was she? Ananke might have been sincerely devoted to them, but Sunny doubted that the young priestess would just watch silently as her home was destroyed. And although it was sometimes easy to forget because of her gentle temperament, she was still a true saint, even if she wasn't. Sunny simply didn't want to fight Ananke. Luckily, Nephi seemed to be holding back her hatred for the sake of their kind guide. She had been raised by her grandmother, after all, even though Neph hadn't shown it. Meeting Ananke must have pulled at the strings of her heart, which still existed, no matter how abused, neglected, and ravaged by torment it was. Let's hurry inside. Oblivious to the hidden conflict between her faith and the people she considered to be its apostles, the young priestess headed toward the gates of the sinister temple with a smile on her lips. Sunny and Nephi's followed, neither of them saying anything. Soon, they passed through the dark entrance and found themselves within a vast hall. Its interior was shrouded in darkness, creating a solemn and mysterious atmosphere. For everyone except Sunny, of course, who could see everything just fine. Narrow beams of stark sunlight were falling from the elaborately carved light wells in the ceiling, intertwined in a complicated pattern. The Temple of the Nightmare spell looked frightening and sinister on the outside, but its interior was quietly beautiful. The intricate tapestry of falling light resembled the breathtaking weave of the inner workings of the spell, while the darkness of the vast hall was like the lightless void between dream and reality where it was hiding. It was strangely peaceful here. What caught Sunny's eye, however, were the white tapestries of enormous spiderwebs growing freely between the columns and support beams of the hall. He shifted uncomfortably and pointed to them, mentally preparing for battle.
I think an abomination did make a nest in the ruins.
Ananke looked at him in confusion for a moment, then chuckled. Her melodious laughter echoed under the roof of the dark hall. No need to be alarmed, my lord. The spider silk has always been here. No one knows what the demon of fate looks like, you see, which is why they're often depicted as a spider. Because of that, spiders were akin to sacred animals to us followers of Weaver. It was forbidden to harm a spider or its web. And we lived peacefully side by side with many. She swept her gaze across the interior of the temple, her eyes growing wistful. I spent my youth in this temple, learning the duties of a priestess from my mother. The spiders who lived here were my friends. They're all gone now, of course. Fate wasn't merciful to them, either, but their silk remains. Sunny gave the young woman a strange look. So, little Ananke was friends with spiders. She must have been one hell of a creepy girl, but then again, who was he to judge? Sunny had never been a well-adjusted child himself.
At least I didn't have to deal with all this sticky web. Gods, living in this temple must have been annoying.
As he thought that, his gaze finally settled on a mass of roughly cut stone towering in the center of the hall. It resembled a wide pillar that had been broken by a devastating blow and then damaged by unbearable heat. Its upper part deformed like a melted candle. The widest beam of sunlight fell vertically on the stone pillar, bathing it in blinding white radiance. Walking closer, Sunny noticed that the whole mass of stone was covered by engravings. There had been many scenes depicted on it once, it seemed. But now, only one remained. He shivered, cut into the ancient stone. An enormous gate was depicted, its titanic surface wrapped in unbreakable chains. In front of it, a tall figure stood, the shape and form of its body hidden by a dark mantle. Only the face could be seen, or rather, the mask of a fearsome demon with ferocious fangs and a crown of 3 twisting horns, drawn to the stone image. Sunny felt his blood stir. Of course, he knew whose figure was carved into the broken pillar. It was Weaver. Sunny remained silent for a while, looking at the broken pillar. Eventually, he turned to Ananke and asked in a hesitant tone,
What's this?
The young priestess approached the mass of dark stone and bowed her head after a few moments of reverent silence. She straightened and looked at him with a proud smile. It's one of the greatest relics of Weave, my lord. This column was brought into the tomb of Ariel by my elders, and then carried all the way here after their exile. It depicts the deeds of Weaver, from birth to the bestowal of the nightmare spell to my people. Her smile dimmed. However, as you can see, the column has been severely damaged over the ages. Now, only this one image remains. Sunny frowned and stared at chains wrapped around the Titanic gate. For whatever reason, just looking at them made him feel deeply uncomfortable.
But what's its meaning?
His voice was full of both curiosity and apprehension. Ananke stepped closer to the broken pillar and studied the ancient engraving for a few moments in solemn silence. Then, she said in a melodious tone, "This is a fragment of the mural that tells the story of one of Weaver's greatest deeds, the story of how the wandering demon braved the eternal abyss." The frown on Sunny's face deepened. He briefly glanced at Nephis and said,
Eternal abyss, do you mean the primordial void?
The young priestess nodded, yes. After the gods sealed the void, Weaver was the only one who managed to enter it, or rather, the only one of those who had entered it who managed to return alive. At least that's what the legends say. Sunny raised an eyebrow. He knew that the gods had sealed the eternal void, from which they were born. He also knew that the unknown were, most likely, the creatures of that void, while the unknown was a specific being that had somehow given life to the 7 demons, and that the reflection of either the former or the latter was forever frozen in the depths of Weaver's eyes. Was that how the demon of fate had ended up carrying the reflection of the unknown within their pupils? By entering the void and witnessing its horror? If so, Sunny wasn't sure if the depiction on the pillar had anything to do with how that event had happened. He doubted that there was an actual gate, no matter how impressive, that barred the way into the eternal void. What kind of gate could seal something that was much greater and more ancient than even the gods? He also was uncertain that Weaver had actually physically entered the void. Of course, it was possible, but there was another probability. As well, the strings of fate stretched from the past into the future. The demon of fate had obviously been much more capable of looking at them than Sunny was. What if Weaver had simply traced the great tapestry of fate all the way back to its origin, to the point when the world hadn't existed yet, and all there was a vast and ever-changing void? If so, then using the Where Is My Eye enchantment was much more perilous than Sunny had thought, and he already considered it deadly. In fact, now that he knew that simply knowing certain things could corrupt living beings, he saw the ability to perceive the strings of fate in a new light. Of course, there was still the possibility that Weaver had indeed ventured into the eternal void physically. Maybe that was how they had ended up having to sever their arm in the Ebony Tower. Although timing didn't really make sense for that to happen, Sunny murmured that it was dangerous. He remained silent for a bit, then asked in a dry tone,
And why, exactly, did Weaver do such a thing?
Ananke smiled. Weaver believed that knowledge was the origin of power, and that was the reason they had ventured into the eternal abyss, to find the answer to the greatest of secrets. Nephis was looking at the ancient mural. Hearing these words, she frowned slightly. Sunny remarked that he had heard as much.
What secret?
The young priestess laughed. How would mortals like us know? Some legends say that the demon of fate wanted to gain knowledge of the origin of the gods. Others say that it was Weaver's own origin that they sought to uncover. Perhaps it was both. Sunny stared at her for a moment.
Perhaps the two are one and the same.
Ananke shook her head.
Whatever it was that Weaver had learned in the abyss isn't that important, really. What matters more is that witnessing the eternal void gave the demon of fate the first reason to create the nightmare spell. That's what we, its priests, believe. So while this mural doesn't depict the inception of the nightmare spell, it does depict the inception of the idea of it, which is why the remains of this column is the greatest relic of Weave.
Sunny tilted his head.
What does the eternal void have to do with the nightmare spell? That's the first time I am hearing about this.
Wasn't Ananke contradicting herself? Before, she had said that the purpose of the nightmare spell was to give living beings a chance to save themselves from the annihilation of the Doom War. But then again, she was a priestess, and religious beliefs were rarely bound by reason. Contradictions were par for the course, and for the same reason, Sunny had to take everything Ananke said with a grain of salt. Still, there could be some truth to what she said. The young priestess bowed to the broken pillar again, then walked away with light steps. "My lord, my lady, come, I will show you the rest of the temple." Sunny and Nephise exchanged a glance, both pondering the meaning of the ancient mural. Neither of them knew what to make of it, so they followed Ananke in silence. Soon, the three of them settled for sleep, tired after the long journey and the forlorn eeriness of Weave. Sunny fell into the embrace of dreams almost instantly. That night, he saw a nightmare in the nightmare. Sunny was a spider with one of his 8 legs broken off. He was crawling across the stone floor, consumed by fear. Behind him, broken chains were falling down with a deafening clangor, and a titanic door stood wide open, its dark maw hiding indescribable horror. Sunny crawled and crawled, but no matter how he strained himself, the horrifying gate was only drew closer. Sunny dreamt of a titanic gate that stood wide open, something boundless and entirely alien hiding in the darkness of its colossal maw. He was a spider with a severed leg, crawling away as broken chains fell to the ground all around him. His mind was consumed by terror, while his heart was full of a cold, bitter feeling of betrayal and regret. Sunny pushed his small body across the stone floor. There were beautiful webs veiling the vast hall of the temple. Their silk threads weaved into a grandiose tapestry. A spark flew, and a moment later, the webs were engulfed in fire. They disappeared in a flash, leaving behind only clouds of acrid smoke that obscured the entire world. At least he couldn't see the harrowing gate anymore. He muttered that he must escape. Suffocating, he crawled through the smoke, and slowly, tortuously, the terror devouring his soul dissipated. Sunny felt as if he had escaped the immediate danger. However, he was hopelessly lost. There was nothing except for searing heat and the dark glow of spreading flame around him. His body was already starting to grow unbearably hot. He froze for a moment, resting and trying to find the way out of the smoldering inferno. Then, for a moment, he felt a breeze caressing his singed carapace from somewhere ahead. Sunny rose to his 7 feet and limped forward as fast as he could. Soon, he left the smoke and the fire behind. He noticed a breeze and whispered there. There was a silent expanse of still water around him now. The smoke was gone, but a thick mist took its place. It swirled and moved, flowing slowly past the shivering figure of the small spider. Sunny took a step and discovered that he could somehow walk on the surface of the water, just like he could within the Soul Sea. Advancing hesitantly, he ventured deeper into the fog. Some time passed, perhaps only a few minutes, perhaps an eternity, and he had lost all sense of direction. He wondered where he was. There was nothing but mist in the world, until something else appeared in the gray void. Sunny trembled. There, ahead of him, something was sitting on the calm surface of the water, staring down. The figure was dressed in tattered rags, its gaunt body hidden from view. It seemed like a human, or was at least human-shaped. The man's dirty hair was hanging like seaweeds, and his face was hidden from view. A jagged band of dark metal rested on his head like a tarnished crown. Suddenly, Sunny felt cold. He asked if it was the Mad Prince. It was one of the 6 heralds of the estuary, one of the 6 plagues. The creature in front of him looked rather pitiful, but it was still a corrupted titan. He was in dire danger. Luckily, the defiled abomination didn't seem to notice the small spider. Mad Prince was sitting motionlessly, staring at his own reflection with an absent expression. It was as though he existed in an entirely different reality. A moment later, Sunny suddenly felt profound relief. A simple realization dispelled his fear and unease. He was sleeping, and it was a dream. Of course it was. Sunny wasn't a spider. He was currently in the temple of the nightmare spell, near Nephise and Ananke, not in the middle of a boundless sea, lost in the mist. The corrupted titan in front of him wasn't real, and the danger the creature represented wasn't real either.
Thank the gods.
As Sunny thought that, he wasn't a spider anymore. However, he was also not himself. Instead, Sunny was tall and nebulous. He had 8 nimble arms, one of them crafted out of pristine white porcelain. His slender figure was veiled by a dark mantle, and a mask of black polished wood hid his features, looking down from his towering height. Sonny studied the pitiful creature in front of him. The Mad Prince didn't look that frightening, especially for a Titan. However, for some unknown reason, the hunched figure filled Sonny with dread. It was just too familiar. As if sensing a gaze, the tattered man suddenly shifted and slowly raised his head. A dreadful face that seemed like a ghastly mask of countless scars and 2 dark eyes burning with unfathomable madness revealed themselves, making Sonny take an involuntary step back. Then, a whisper that was like broken glass resounded, scratching at his ears. The Mad Prince whispered, "Who dares dream about me?" And just like that, the relief Sonny felt was destroyed.
He knows that this is a dream. No, that's not possible. How?
The eyes of the Defiled slowly gained refocus, becoming sharp and crushing, pressed down by the unbearable weight of harrowing insanity hidden in their dark depths. Sonny took another step back and held his breath.
It's a dream, it's a dream.
The creature's lips, meanwhile, twisted in a wicked smile. The Mad Prince suddenly froze, then groaned and struck his head with a fist. He realized it was Sonny and asked which one he was. "I can't remember, but it's also an answer." His ugly face rippled, as if trying to assume a human expression. "You're neither, you're an imposter." The creature's voice suddenly grew dark and vicious. "You's murderer." An unhinged laugh escaped his lips, and then the Mad Prince slowly rose, his tattered rags moved, shrouded in mist. As Sonny took another step back, desperately trying to wake up, the Defiled took a step forward. "How about it, murderer? Come closer, I'll tell you a secret. You deserve that much." There was suddenly nowhere to go. The gray mist became solid, blocking all paths to retreat, and Sonny was, indeed, curious against his will. He was a great lover of secrets, after all. As he shuddered, feeling his thoughts spin out of control, there was suddenly a presence between him and the Mad Prince. Someone else was standing there, blocking the view of the mad creature with his back. It was a young man in a black tunic, with long raven-black hair and a grim expression on his pale face. The Sin of Solace.
What's he doing here?
The wraith seemed uncharacteristically serious as he stared the Mad Prince down, without turning his head. The apparition said in a voice that was neither snide nor mocking. Instead, it was grave. "What are you doing, fool? Summon your horse and get out of here. Hurry." Shielded by the Sin of Solace, Sonny was suddenly capable of pushing through the mist again. He backed away as the Defiled smiled wider. "Where are you going, murderer? Don't you want to learn a secret? You won't regret knowing it. Maybe you'll." Sonny didn't know what was happening, but he was sure of one thing. Whatever it was that the Mad Prince wanted to tell him wasn't something he should ever learn, unless he wanted to become as mad and broken as the Defiled abomination was. It was already crazy enough to be fighting for his life, or rather, for his humanity, within a dream which he was dreaming inside the third nightmare. Staggering away, Sonny called upon his shadows. Instantly, 3 figures rose from below. Taciturn saint, scrawny imp, and a tenebrous steed shrouded in darkness. The Mad Prince exploded with laughter. Sonny said that they would run. Good, this makes me feel nostalgic." Saint was the first one to fall. Before she could even move, a sword suddenly flashed, followed by a turbulent whirlwind of surging mist. The graceful stone knight froze, a thin crack suddenly appearing on her onyx armor. Then, as silently as she had been born, Saint crumbled into 1,000 shards of black stone. A cloud of ruby dust exploded into the air, painting the still water crimson. Sonny shouted her name. Sonny's eyes widened, but before he could do anything, the Sin of Solace pushed him away. "Run, you bastard! She's not real." The imp was second. The little fiend hesitated, visibly scared by the tattered figure of the Mad Titan. However, then, it bravely jumped forward, reaching for the flesh of the Defiled with his claws. The invisible sword whistled again, and the scrawny figure suddenly staggered, with liquid flames flowing out of Imp's mouth. He looked at Sunny with a frightened expression. Then, his eyes grew dim, and his little head slid off his neck, falling into the water with a quiet splash. Sunny felt as if his own mind was on the verge of breaking, pressing down the tempest of pain and guilt raging in his heart. He gritted his teeth and turned away. His hand grasped Nightmare's mane, and with a stifled scream, he jumped onto the stallion's back. The dark courser was already galloping away through the swirling mist. The mad prince's laugh reached them from behind. "Where are you going, murderer? I am not done with you." Sunny didn't turn to look back. Gripping the sides of Nightmare with his thighs, he raised both hands and pressed them to his ears.
Don't listen.
However, he still heard it, the voice of the Sin of Solace, who said with a hint of resignation in his hateful, familiar voice, Sunny's own voice, "Damn lunatic, are you trying to steal my job?" He had never been so happy to have a wraith born from the whisper of the demon of dread stuck in his head before. Nightmare flew through the mist, and soon, the veil of it obscured the Mad Prince and the Sin of Solace, muffling their voices until nothing except silence remained. Sunny had also turned into himself. Finally, he had a human body once again, as well as 2 human hands. The dark mantle was replaced by the soft silk of the Shroud of Dusk. Looking down, he patted the black steed on the shoulder and let out a shaky breath.
I think we are safe now.
Then, he hesitated for a moment and added in a small voice,
But do you think that I can wake up now?
Nightmare huffed and struck the surface of the still water with his hooves, soaring high into the air. As they rose higher and higher, the mist grew thinner and thinner, until eventually, a ray of sunshine broke through its blinding veil, and as soon as it did, Sunny woke up with a start. He let out a cry of pain. He sat up, covered in cold sweat, with his heart beating wildly. Sunny grabbed at his chest and froze, looking around the dark room of the desolate temple. Slowly, his panic started to dissolve.
A dream, it was just a dream.
Sunny slowly exhaled, then shuddered and shook his head. No, it might have been a dream, but it definitely hadn't been just a dream. He didn't know what kind of power could have allowed the Mad Prince, who was most likely either dead already or far, far away, to appear in his nightmare. However, he was certain that the creature he had met in the dream wasn't a simple figment of his imagination. Sunny didn't know whether the tattered abomination he had faced was the defiled Titan himself or some echo left behind by his passing. But he knew that hearing the secret the abomination wanted to share would have been the end of him.
Gods damn it, even the dreams aren't safe here.
As his heart calmed down a little, he sat in silence for a while, trying to gather his thoughts. There were a lot of strange things about that dreadful dream. However, before he could consider them carefully, a sudden worry clouded his mind. Sunny hurriedly sent his shadows to check on Nephi's and Ananke, making sure that both were sleeping peacefully in the neighboring rooms. He then shuddered at the memory of his shadows being destroyed and proceeded to summon them one after another. He called upon the dark courser first. As the Sin of Solace said, saint and imp shouldn't have been real. The black steed could be summoned into his dream because that was the nature of Nightmare's powers, but the other 2 were different, so only Nightmare had actually faced the Mad Prince. Most likely, the black stallion appeared in the shadows. Keeping to his intangible form, he seemed agitated, but otherwise unharmed. Relieved, Sunny let out a long sigh.
Thank you, buddy, you really saved my hide there.
Dismissing Nightmare, he summoned Saint next. The graceful knight appeared out of the darkness. As stoic and indifferent as ever, she was unharmed, feeling as if a great burden had been lifted off his heart. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment and told himself he was safe. Thanking the gods, Saint gave him a strange look, but remained silent. Well, of course she did.
Now, no, actually stay here. Keep watch throughout the night, all right.
The graceful knight stared at him for a few moments, then turned away and silently left the room to stand guard in the corridor. Sunny took a deep breath and rubbed his face. Now, only Imp remained. He summoned the scrawny goblin, then scratched the back of his head.
All right, that little rascal is still stuck digesting the armor of the black turtle. Damn it. When will he stop lazing around?
But before Sunny could finish the thought, a frightening figure suddenly rose from the shadows. towering above him like a demon forged out of dark steel and sharp blades.
Zarg, what the...
Unbeknownst to Sonny, the little rascal had already awakened from his slumber, only he wasn't so little anymore. Sonny had grown accustomed to calling his youngest shadow an imp. However, now the ravenous fiend was finally worthy of his fearsome name. The creature in front of Sonny couldn't be called little, nor could it be called scrawny. It was almost as tall as Saint, towering above him like a demonic warrior whose body had been forged out of dark steel in the infernal flames of hell. There were a lot of similarities with how Imp had looked during their last battle in Falcon Scott. But there were also differences. The original ravenous fiend had been tall but gaunt. His body had been covered in thick plates of black bone armor, and he was as ferocious as he was stealthy, like a vengeful wraith born out of hungry darkness. The new and improved Imp, however, wasn't gaunt. Instead, he seemed like a knight clad in a suit of plate armor. That armor wasn't made out of bone, either. It was made out of a strange dark metal. The ravenous shadow had seemed like he was forged out of black steel before, but the look of his metallic body was changed now. It acquired a dark sheen and a glossy quality, as though the transcendent devil had been cast out of black silver or covered in a layer of dull chrome. There were changes in the design of his armor, too. It was as though Fiend had been forged out of countless broken swords. There were curved blades growing from his elbows and knees, as well as ferocious spikes rising here and there from his dark armor. His face was hidden behind the visor of a fearsome helmet, with twisting horns rising from it and a jagged line breaking its surface where the fiend's terrible mouth was hidden, brimming with dagger-like teeth. His claws were like short swords, and in his ferocious eyes, infernal flames burned with intense heat. Sonny whispered crap, and that demonic monstrosity was currently staring at Sonny with an extremely nasty expression in its glowing orange-red eyes. Sonny awkwardly cleared his throat.
Hey there, buddy.
Imp's mouth split in a sinister grin, releasing more heat and infernal glow. Sonny forced out a smile.
Wow, you look great. I guess all that delicious magical steel I found and fed you, out of nothing but pure kindness, maybe, really did you some good.
He coughed.
Say, you wouldn't be remembering all the times I kicked and berated you, would you? Or, thinking about strange things like revenge, would you?
Imp took a step forward, the glow of his demonic eyes and incinerating maw falling on Sonny's face. His grin widened, the sharp steel teeth glinting in the darkness. His voice sounded like a roaring flame as he spoke of revenge. With that, Imp raised his hand. In that moment, Sonny's expression changed, and he added evenly,
Because if you do, you master will have a good reason to find out just how sturdy this new body of yours is.
Imp's grin froze for a moment, and his hand did too. He hesitated for a moment, and then carefully fixed a crease on Sonny's tunic. The steel fiend growled politely, saying master was good. Then he backed away, stared at Sonny for a bit, and hurriedly left the room. Sonny let out a relieved sigh, then smiled. He mused that they grow up so fast. One of his shadows followed Imp into the corridor to see what the big guy was up to. Moving too silently for a creature of his size and weight, the steel devil approached Saint and stopped next to her, as if to join her in guarding the rooms. There they stood, Saint and Fiend. Imp was acting as nonchalantly as the taciturn knight was, but Sonny didn't miss the fact that the bastard was puffing out his chest and secretly throwing glances at Saint, as if waiting for her reaction. After a while, the stone knight finally turned her head and stared at the steel fiend indifferently. Imp seemed to have secretly held his breath. Saint remained motionless for a while, then raised her hand and casually flicked the fiend's chest with a finger. After hearing a melodious ring, she tilted her head a little. Finally, the graceful knight nodded curtly and turned away. Imp looked beyond himself, maintaining a stoic facade worthy of his ferocious appearance. He also looked away and returned to silently guarding the corridor. However, the flames in his eyes were dancing jubilantly. Sonny scoffed. He shook his head, then summoned the runes to learn exactly what had changed about Ravenous Fiend, except for appearance. The runes read,
The runes read, Shadow Ravenous Fiend, Shadow Rank, Transcendent, Shadow Class, Devil, Shadow Description. A pitiful little creature traveled through a nightmarish land. Shadow attributes: lucky, marvel, ravenous, shadow sworn, complete steel body. The greater steel body had become complete steel body. Its description read: Attribute description: this shadow's body is forged out of sublime blessed steel and is without a flaw.
It seemed that consuming the silver armor of the black turtle hadn't only improved the quality of the alloy from which Imp's body was made, but also removed all the remaining imperfections from it. Granted, Sunny was inclined to take its supposed flawlessness with a grain of salt. After all, he had recently learned that flaws were one of the universal laws of the world. Still, if the spell deemed it necessary to call Imp's newly evolved body flawless, he had to be very close to having no physical vulnerabilities. It seemed that Sunny finally had another powerful shadow to face the most dire enemies side by side with. Imp was now perfectly capable of participating in battles alongside Saint and Nightmare, reaching the fearsome level of power that a transcendent devil was supposed to possess. Sunny thought it was good, just in time, with his indestructible steel body, which was a weapon in and of itself. As well as his dual affinity for shadows and flame, the ferocious fiend would be a terror on the battlefield. Sunny's face grew somber. Things had been calm for a while, ever since Ananke had found them, but he knew that there were plenty of harrowing battles waiting for them in the depths of the tomb of Ariel. Imp, or was Sunny supposed to call him Fiend now, didn't get new abilities, which was logical, really, since the black turtle was only a monster, and the gluttonous shadow hadn't even consumed the flesh of the abominations, only its armor. Still, the scrawny goblin had become a fearsome ogre. He was going to significantly increase Sunny's battle power, not the least because of his carefully chosen diet. Sunny had given up on feeding Ravenous Fiend a lot of valuable stuff so that his growth didn't become muddled. Imp's main affinities had to be established first: steel and shadows. The flames he had absorbed from the colossal body of the Sun Prince were a pleasant side effect, increasing the power of the Steel Devil's attacks. But what Sunny had really wanted was to make his youngest shadow as indestructible as possible. Saint possessed an incredible level of defense, which was only made greater by her masterful battle prowess. But Imp was different. If not guided cautiously, he could have ended up being vulnerable, considering the types of situations Sunny often found himself in. That vulnerability was bound to result in him losing his first shadow sooner rather than later. Survivability was king. He had regrettably proven it himself over and over again, clinging to life by the skin of his teeth on many occasions. Which was why Sunny was so impressed by how hard to kill the original scavenger had been. He had experienced the toughness of the spiteful fiend's bone armor personally, after all, and wanted to make Imp at least as durable. If the ravenous shadow managed to approach the level of defense Saint possessed, that would have been even better. In that regard, Sunny seemed to have overshot his initial goal by a lot. Imp's complete steel body wasn't only as durable as Saint's graceful body was. Vastly more so. His metal carapace was sturdier than her stone-like armor, and much more importantly, that durability encompassed the entire body of the ravenous devil, not just its surface. Although Saint was hard to wound, she was actually quite vulnerable once her armor and resilient skin were breached. The internals of her miraculous stone body were well protected, but fragile. The ruby dust that flowed out of the wounds like blood was proof of that. Ravenous fiend, however, was now fully tempered, both outside and inside. There were no vulnerabilities that an enemy could exploit, at least not an enemy using physical attacks, which meant that while Imp could deliver fearsome blows, his true power lay in being nearly impervious to physical harm. He could become the shield of the shadow cohort, or a punching bag. Sunny scratched the back of his head and looked in the direction where Imp was standing, hidden from view by a wall with a guilty expression. The poor guy hadn't realized what the future held for him, had he? Sorry, buddy. He shook his head and remained silent for a while, thinking. There were two fully matured transcendent devils serving him now. Sunny himself had become unbelievably strong due to Shadow Dance. At least for an Ascended, if augmented by Nephi's, his power was probably comparable to some Saints now, enough to give him a fighting chance, if nothing else. If Sunny was assisted by his shadows, most Saints would probably be the ones at risk, not him. And that was without Soul Serpent, who should have become the strongest of the shadows by now. But still, that power wasn't enough. After experiencing the dire perils of the upper reaches of the great river, and knowing that he would have to venture far downstream, into the distant past, Sonny knew that even his current ridiculous level of strength wasn't enough to slay the kind of adversaries he would be facing. The problem was, he was almost at his limit. The problem was, there were very few things he could realistically achieve in a short amount of time to increase his power even further. The only feasible one was helping Nightmare evolve into an ascended terror and unlock his Dream Curse ability. That was going to happen relatively soon. But after that, Sonny would reach a dead end. With a lot of effort, he could potentially become a terror. But even that boost wasn't going to be significant enough to change the odds in his favor. More memories, and stronger ones at that, weren't going to cut it either. Sonny had grown a lot, more than any master in history had, perhaps, but now, his head was pressed against an indestructible ceiling. The only way for him to leap to a new height was by breaking that ceiling and becoming a saint, which could only happen after the nightmare, meaning too late, of course. He had recently learned from Ananke that people could transcend without the assistance of the spell. That path was open to him. But sadly, Sonny didn't have 100 spare years or more to slowly learn how to do just that. What was left then? He frowned.
Actually, I am thinking about it all wrong.
Sonny had been a loner for most of his life, and even after learning how to rely on others and trust his friends, he still put a lot of meaning into personal strength, which wasn't exactly unwise, but at the same time served as an artificial limit. Although he hadn't lived through Nef's second nightmare, the lesson she had learned there resonated with his own experiences. Personal strength was important, but it paled in comparison to true power. Take Antarctica, for example. Sonny had achieved incredible things there, but he hadn't achieved them alone. The evacuation of hundreds of millions of civilians was only possible because the government had mobilized vast resources to send the first and second evacuation armies into the southern quadrant. Without the irregulars, without the mundane soldiers and thousands of awakened who had fought and died to save the people of Antarctica, Sonny wouldn't have achieved anything. His personal strength was nothing when compared to the united determination of all those brave people. It was the same here in the third nightmare. Sonny had to destroy a dire enemy, the forces of defilement populating the corrupted city of Verge and the 6 plagues that ruled it: Dread Lord, Torment, Undying Slaughter, Soul Stealer, Devouring Beast, and Mad Prince. So why was he only thinking about his personal strength? Wasn't the power of his allies also his power? Nephi's, Cassie, Effie, Kai, Jet, and even Mordred, they were as much a part of his power as Saint, Imp, and Nightmare. Since Sonny had reached the ceiling of what he himself could achieve as a master, wouldn't it be wiser for him to put his efforts into empowering his allies? Shrouded in darkness, Sonny slowly nodded. This was it. That was the path he had to take if he wanted to survive the nightmare. After reaching Fallen Grace, he and Nephi's had to find the rest of the cohort, and once they found them, Sonny had to make sure that his friends, and Mordred too, grew as powerful as possible. He had to make them into a force capable of defeating the 6 plagues, for their sake, and also his own. Sonny sighed and closed his eyes for a moment. The future was daunting, but when had it not been so? Approaching the window, Sonny opened the heavy shutters and looked at the desolate landscape of Weave from the height of one of the Nightmare Spell Temple's bell towers. The sky was veiled in impenetrable darkness. The waters flowing through the canals of the floating city glowed with iridescent radiance, bathing the empty streets in ethereal glow. Usually, the light of the great river at night was dreamlike and beautiful, but contrasted against the forlorn desolation of Weave. It made for an eerie sight. It was like a city of ghosts. He sighed, thinking about the cruel fate that had befallen the followers of Weaver and the creature that had driven them to extinction, the Mad Prince. A dark expression appeared on Sonny's face. He was reluctant to think about his meeting with the Defiled Titan, or at least some vestige of the abhorrent creature that had found its way into his dreams. It almost felt as though thinking about the abomination would summon it here. Nevertheless, Sonny had to consider what he had seen and heard in the harrowing dream, because it was too ominous. He said he dreamt of being Weaver. The spider with a broken leg was, without a doubt, a representation of the demon of fate. It wasn't surprising that Sunny had dreamt of the nebulous demon after witnessing the mural in the grand hall of the temple, and neither was it unexpected that he had assumed the demon's role in his nightmare. Weaver's blood was running through Sunny's veins, after all, and he too had an innate affinity to fate. The latter was the reason for the former. In the end, it was because of being fated that he had stumbled on the egg of the loathsome thieving bird and received the forbidden lineage of the sinister demon. Sinister. Sunny had actually never thought about Weaver in such terms before, mostly because he had benefited greatly from their tenuous connection, but also because there was no reason to. In all honesty, he had admired the mysterious demon, with no particular reason except for the fact that the demon of fate was an intelligent, cunning, and fearsome deity. But the more Sunny learned about the end of the dream realm and the nightmare spell, the more ominous of a figure Weaver seemed. And how could they not? Who could be more dangerous than a creature that wielded knowledge of fate itself? Sunny and Nephis had argued about the nature of the spell, whether it was a fundamentally benevolent force or not. He was inclined to believe that it had been created for a noble purpose, which wasn't to say that it wasn't a vile and terrible curse for the humans of the waking world. But he was also starting to suspect that neither of them really understood the true intention and scope of what Weaver had done at all. The nightmare spell seemed like a tool to make living beings stronger in the face of encroaching corruption. But there were too many discrepancies between what was apparent and what was hidden beneath the surface. The nightmares, the slow but inevitable escalation, the sheer convenience of it all. What was Weaver's true goal? How had the rudimentary version of the spell Ananke wielded grown to become the pervasive and nearly omnipotent power that seemed to be as absolute as the universal laws of reality that the gods established? Come to think of it, how had the Doom War ended? What had actually happened to the demons, the gods, and Weaver? Where did the corruption that had devoured the dream realm come from, and why? Just like always, Sunny had no answers. More than that, these weren't even the questions he had to ponder. The defilement was a form of corruption that had spread from the estuary, and there were 6 champions of it: Dread Lord, Devouring Beast, Undying Slaughter, Torment, Soul Stealer, and Mad Prince, the Mad Prince, who seemed strangely familiar when Sunny had dreamt of him. He wondered why the prince felt familiar. He shivered. The defiled horror seemed like a human. No, like a broken marionette of a human. He was like a flesh puppet worn by a boundless sea of madness, to the point where the madness seemed like the actual being, while the human body just seemed like its ragged shell. Sunny still shuddered when he remembered the creature's eyes. The torment hiding in them was like a chilling storm of insanity born from 1,000 years of horror, agony, and knowledge. Knowledge was the heaviest thing in the world, after all, as well as the origin of power, and that was why he was very uncomfortable with the fact that the Mad Prince seemed so familiar. Sunny hadn't noticed it at the start, because the abominable creature was too different from him, but when the sin of Solace appeared, he had to admit to himself that the defiled Titan and the sword Wraith were eerily similar, which meant that Sunny and the Mad Prince were similar, too. He stared at the ghostly landscape of Weave for a while.
Have I assumed the role of that abomination?
Sunny and Nephis had discussed how strange their entry into the nightmare was. Whose roles did they assume? Who could have been present that far upstream at the moment of their arrival? He had also theorized that the Mad Prince might have died there, as evident by the piece of flotsam with deranged runes carved into it. It was strange to think that a corrupted Titan could have become an ascended tyrant, but not impossible. The spell could have decided that it was the best and only option, slightly changing the rules. The third nightmare was different from the previous 2, to begin with challengers entering it with their own bodies. That was one possibility. The other, more harrowing possibility, was that the abominable madmen could have been the sin of Solace from the future, conjured into the present by some strange quirk of the great river. Ananke had said it herself that the flow of time in the tomb of Ariel was often strange and unpredictable. The Mad Prince could also have been the future version of Sunny, who had either been devoured by the corruption or the sin of Solace itself.
No way.
He suddenly felt incredibly cold. But it was too compelling of a theory to be discarded because of the outrage he felt at the thought of being able to turn into that bastard. The letters of the modern alphabet being mixed with the deranged runes, the ability to spread madness, the physical resemblance. It wasn't only the Mad Prince. Either, the description of the rest of the 6 plagues was also extremely ominous. The Soul Stealer, who could wear the skin of those he killed. The Undying Slaughter, who was overcome by insatiable bloodlust. The Devouring Beast, who consumed the bodies of her slain foes. The Dread Lord and Torment. Didn't they sound like corrupted, twisted versions of the members of the cohort? All except Nephi's, who was incorruptible. Sonny could reluctantly acknowledge that some form of time, distortion could have happened inside the tomb of Ariel. He could even admit that it was quite possible for them to fail in conquering the nightmare and succumb to corruption. He decided it was too ridiculous a thought. However, what were the chances of all of them surviving that and becoming saints in the process? The 6 plagues were vastly more powerful than the members of the cohort, to the point that an entire civilization of powerful awakened hadn't managed to slay a single one of them. 2 civilizations, even, considering the King of Twilight and his people. No, it was far more likely that Nephi's and her cohort were pitted against nightmare creature resembling the perverse versions of themselves because of a little nudge from the spell. The spell had shown itself to be fond of such ghastly, but poetic twists of fate. After all, still. How had the runes of the waking world language ended up on the piece of flotsam? Sonny remained motionless for a long time, looking at the desolate expanse of weave. Eventually, the glowing waters dimmed, and the 7 suns emerged from the river. Sonny sensed the shadows move in the adjacent rooms, telling him that Ananke and Nephi's had woken up. He closed his eyes for a few long moments, trying to chase away the heavy thoughts. He then dismissed Saint and Imp. It was time to meet the new day. Hopefully, he would get some answers after reaching fallen grace.
I need to strengthen Nightmare as soon as possible.
The Mad Prince had invaded his dreams once, and there was no guarantee that it wouldn't happen again. Sonny needed to protect himself while he slept. And since helping the Black Stallion evolve was also the only way for him to strengthen himself in the short term, he could achieve both goals at once that way.
I am going to have to craft some memories.
Luckily, with the crown of Twilight supplying him with essence, weaving strings of it to create memories wouldn't be as taxing and long of a process as it had been before, thinking about how many soul shards he had and what memories to create. Sonny rubbed his face and went outside to meet his companions. They were going to leave Weave soon. Sonny, Nephi's, and Ananke spent several days in the Temple of the Nightmare Spell, resting and exploring the forlorn city as they prepared for the last leg of the journey. These days were strangely tranquil and peaceful, but also bittersweet. It was because the 3 of them knew that their time together was coming to an end. The young priestess, who had been their caretaker and guide for the last few weeks, wasn't going to be able to follow her wards to where they needed to go. Fallen Grace, the city of dusk, lay far beyond the boundary of where she was allowed to exist. Such was the fate of all Riverborn. Sonny and Nephi's were both painfully aware of what awaited Ananke in the future. That was why, even though they tried to hide their emotions, a dark shadow was cast over their hearts. The young priestess herself, meanwhile, seemed at peace with her bitter fate. An easy smile often appeared on her lips, and she fully dedicated herself to making preparations to send the 2 of them on their way. Sonny and Nephi's were going to have to travel far downstream on their own. They needed supplies and knowledge to reach Fallen Grace without Ananke, so she was busy making sure they would have everything they needed. They gathered various resources from all over the desolate ruins of Weave. The young priestess also taught them how to navigate the great river and recognize various perils hiding in its depths. Nephi's continued to learn how to steer the enchanted ketch, while Sonny spent his time weaving threads of shadow essence and studying the estuary key. Eventually, there was nothing left for them in the orphaned city, as the beautiful light of the 7 rising suns suffused the cool morning air. Ananke led them through the empty streets for the last time and jumped lightly onto the deck of the graceful ketch. She called for them to come, saying they would sail downstream today. Sonny and Nephi's glanced at each other, then silently followed her aboard the boat. The young priestess watched them with a smile, then nodded and gestured to the steering oar. "My lady, it's best if you practice steering while I am still with you. Remember our lessons. You can surely succeed." Nephi's looked at her for a while, her face motionless. She hesitated a little before sitting down on the helmsman's bench and taking the oar. Sunny, meanwhile, frowned.
Wait, what about you? If we are going to sail away on the ketch, how are you going to get back to Weave?
Ananke shook her head. Weave stretches far downstream, just like it does upstream. There are several island ships we will visit before it's time for me to turn back. I will leave you at the lower house of parting, where there are other vessels for me to use. He hesitated for a few moments, then nodded reluctantly. Sunny hadn't come to terms with how they would have to leave Ananke behind still, but there was nothing he could do and nothing he knew how to say. They had no other choice, but the farewell wasn't upon them yet. Perhaps he would be able to find the correct words in the days to come. With a sigh, Sunny lowered himself to the deck. Usually, Ananke would sit on the bench at the stern of the ketch, while Nephi's would be opposite him at the middle point of the deck. Today, however, their familiar positions were reversed. Neph was holding the steering oar, while the priestess sat down near Sunny. He had grown somewhat accustomed to how beautiful the young Ananke was, but looking at her directly still felt strange, especially because of how bright her smile was and how heavy his heart was. "Thank you, my lord." Sunny looked at her somberly, surprised. The young priestess sighed lightly, then looked at the desolate landscape of Weave with a wistful expression. Sunny asked what for. "For wanting to learn about my birthplace so much. I am glad to have shared its stories with someone, very much." He lowered his head and remained silent for a few moments. He agreed, sure, no problem. At that moment, Nephi's took a deep breath and then said something in a resolute voice. The word that escaped her lips echoed from the walls of the canal, and a subtle ripple spread across the surface of the flowing water. It was as though the word itself contained an invisible power capable of reshaping the world. Soon, a strong gale rose, filling the sails of the old ketch. It was both similar and different from how Ananke summoned the wind. Neph's shaping was more direct and crude, lacking stability, but at the same time, it contained a wild and fearsome will. As a result, the gale summoned by the true name of the wind was able to propel the boat forward despite not being as strong as what the young priestess had been able to call upon. The word they spoke was the same, but the result differed. It was because of the nature of the sorcery of names. Unlike other types of sorcery, which acted through fixed conduits like essence threads and runes, it used the shapers themselves as the conduit. Nephi's was of a lower rank than Ananke, so she couldn't channel the power of the word as potently. But at the same time, her body and soul were aflame with the divine lineage of Sun God, and more importantly, she possessed a true name of her own. Those with true names were connected to the mystical side of the world much closer, would be influenced by the hidden powers of the world much more, and be able to exert greater influence in turn, which was why Nephi's was able to control the ketch with a sufficient level of power despite not being a saint like Ananke. "You're doing great, my lady. Speak the names of concealment next." Neph lingered, her face a little pale. The sorcery of names didn't come without a cost. Just like the other types of sorcery, channeling a word put a strain on the shaper's body, as while uttering it didn't consume essence. Controlling the outcome did, eventually. She gritted her teeth and said the rest of the names the priestess had taught her, arranging them into a phrase. The ketch flew through the canals. Soon, it broke free of the city boundaries and sped into the open expanse of the great river, leaving the forlorn city behind. They were once again traveling downstream, deeper into the past. The next morning, they reached the first of the remote island ships Ananke had told them about. It slowly appeared from beyond the horizon, illuminated by the dreamlike sunlight. This one was different from the House of Parting. The artificial island was much larger, and instead of a solemn and solitary building, it encompassed a whole district. There were many houses, gardens, and water features, all of them bright and colorful. Despite the same desolation that reigned in Weave, this place seemed strangely festive. It was easy to imagine how full of vitality it had once been. Ananke's eyes glistened with nostalgia. She smiled softly and said, her voice melodious. "This is the House of Youth." Sunny and Nephi's looked at the bright island ship, wondering what its purpose was. The sight of it was a little uplifting, and a little sad, contrasted against the beautiful atmosphere. The emptiness seemed even more poignant. The young priestess sighed. "This is one of the 7 houses that Riverborn spent their childhood and adolescence at." She lingered for a moment and then explained. "As you can imagine, children grow up differently here on the Great River. From the moment they're born, their bodies are beholden to the currents of its time. If brought upstream, they will swiftly reach adulthood. At the same time, their parents will have to grow older if they wish to remain with their child. In a span of a few generations, families will be torn apart, and a city will be broken into pieces." Ananke shook her head. "Of course, it's also cruel to thrust a child into adulthood while their mind remains immature. So, the 7 houses exist. Actually, it's a bit strange for me to explain these things, since that's just how life in the tomb of Ariel is. To me, it's the manner in which outsiders grow up that seems odd." She laughed. "I couldn't believe my mother when she told me that kids outside just grow up inevitably, while remaining in the same place, and have no choice on when to become adults. How scary. Can you imagine?" Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other, befuddled. After a while, he cleared his throat.
Yeah, I can easily imagine, but wait, what's the exact purpose of these 7 houses?
Fallen Grace was most likely built in the same way, so it would be good to know. Plus, he was simply curious. The young priestess smiled. "It's simple, really. When a man and a woman decide to have a child, they travel downstream to the house of birth. The children are born and spend the first months of their lives there." She looked at the waters of the great river and added, her voice wistful. "As the mind of the child matures, they and their parents travel upstream to the next house, where the kids become toddlers. After a year or two, the family travels to the 3rd house, and so forth. This way, kids have a chance to have proper childhoods. It's a happy time for the families, and moving on to the next house is a big event for the children, akin to the birthday ceremony you outsiders have." Sunny lingered for a few moments, then nodded. The river people didn't have the same perception of time as the rest of humans. They still counted time in months and years, but these measurements were simply traditions brought into the tomb of Ariel by those who had come from the outside, although there were something akin to seasonal changes within the tomb of Ariel. The idea of a solar year was meaningless here. So, the children growing up on the Great River would put much more meaning into traveling upstream and getting an older body than into an empty thing like getting older by an imaginary year, especially since their lives weren't limited by the dwindling number of years that remained before they grew old and died. Ananke noticed his contemplative expression and added, "This last house, the House of Youth, is where our bodies reach the stage of the cusp of adulthood. The parents usually leave for the main city and leave the kids with other youths, yet different kids reach mental maturity at different paces. Some spend just a few years here before moving on to reunite with their families. Some stay longer. Some lazy rascals even refuse to become adults for decades." Her cheeks turned slightly pink. "I might have been one of those rascals myself." Sunny smiled, imagining the dignified and wise elderly woman he knew avoiding the responsibilities of adulthood for as long as she could, getting into all kinds of mischief with the other young Riverborn. Had Ananke really been such an unruly troublemaker once? He shook her head.
But wait, if that's true, then how would these youths have families of their own? They would turn into infants by traveling to the house of birth, no?
Ananke nodded.
Indeed, that's why the whole city migrates some distance upstream each generation. That gives the young ones a chance to have children of their own, of course. It also means that their parents grow a little older with each migration. But our lifespans are long, the future is more forgiving than the past. The eldest ones assume guidance roles in the 7 houses as well.
She remained silent for a few moments.
Nevertheless, a city might reach a point where the older part of its population wouldn't be able to migrate anymore. That never happened to Weave, since many died in the battles against the corrupted, and those who survived too long usually chose to leave from the House of Parting. Our history also doesn't stretch that far, but downstream, where the great cities of Sibyls used to be, that was how new settlements were created. The young split off to start life anew.
Sunny and Nephis remained silent, thinking about how bizarre the civilization of the Great River was. After all, the way of life of the river people was indeed completely different from the outside world. Even simple things like parenthood, childhood, and growing up were entirely unlike what they knew. Ananke sighed and said that life always finds a way, which was why it was even sadder to see it destroyed. How it had been here in Weave, Ananke sighed.
There had been a single migration after I left the House of Youth, so I will be able to guide you past all the 7 houses to the House of Parting far downstream. It shouldn't take us more than a few days.
With that, she turned to Nephis and smiled.
In the meantime, my lady, I will help you grow accustomed to controlling the ketch.
As she and Neph talked, Sunny looked at the bright buildings of the House of Youth, which were drawing closer and closer, and then slowly drifting past. He was thinking about what Ananke's childhood must have looked like, as well as about the bleak and cold childhood of his own. Wasn't it funny? The young priestess, who had been born in a tomb built by the demon of dread from the corpse of an unholy titan, clung desperately to her childhood, not wanting to become an adult. While he, who had been born in the waking world, couldn't wait to leave that bitter page of his life behind, and in the end, they had both ended up in this ketch together. Sunny sighed.
It would be nice if the kids of the future, the waking world's future, could live like her and not like me.
That was such a strange thought. Eventually, Ananke replaced Nephis at the steering oar. Neph looked drained after commanding the winds for an entire day. Nevertheless, Sunny felt that her eyes were duller than mere exhaustion could explain. Throwing a questioning glance at her, he asked if she was all right. She lingered for a few moments, then nodded silently, sitting down and leaning her back against the side of the ketch. Nephis then tiredly closed her eyes. She hadn't slept since they left Weave. And although masters like them could easily remain awake for days, mental fatigue still had a way of catching up with them.
I guess she doesn't want to talk about whatever it's that's troubling her.
Sunny studied Neph's pale face, then quietly summoned Nightmare and ordered him to guard her dreams. The tenebrous steed hid in the shadows at the bow of the boat, formless and watchful. Not satisfied with that, Sunny sent all but one of his shadows to augment him. Memories of meeting the manifestation of the Prince of Madness still haunted his thoughts. Later, there was nothing for him to do but continue weaving threads of essence. Sunny sat on the deck of the ketch with his legs crossed, his fingers dancing in the air. By now, he was proficient enough in creating essence strings to not pay a lot of attention to the process. Ut was a far cry from when he had attempted weaving for the first time and constantly cut his hands to the bone. His painfully gained experience and the increased sensitivity that bone weave granted to his fingertips made it easier. Now, Sunny just needed time and essence to create as long a thread as he needed to weave a memory. It still took some time. After a while, Ananke looked at him with curiosity and asked, "My lord, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing?" Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then turned his head slightly. He hesitated before answering, knowing how weird she was about all things involving the demon of fate. Nevertheless, eventually, he said that he was creating essence strings and weaving. Her azure eyes widened slightly. You're a weaver, my lord." A weaver? Sunny tilted his head.
If you mean someone who uses weaver's sorcery, then yes, although I am not very proficient with it.
The young priestess was staring at him with reverence. He sighed.
Why were these weavers very rare in your time?
She nodded slowly. Extremely so, my lord. The sorcery created by the demon of fate wasn't something mortals could easily learn, or gods. Even, there were only a few who mastered it. One of the 2 high priests of the nightmare spell was one such sorcerer. My mother told me that he was a shaper of souls and a master of all kinds of magic. Are there a lot of weavers like you in the future? Sunny slowly shook his head.
No, there are a few whose aspects allow them to create memories, but as far as I know, I am the only one who truly knows how to weave sorcery, unbound by the limits of my abilities.
He sighed.
I never had a teacher, though everything I know I've learned myself. That's why I can only create copies of the weaves created by the spell or modify them at best.
The young priestess looked at him silently for a while, then smiled. But, my lord, wouldn't that mean that the nightmare spell is your teacher? How can there be a better teacher than that? The corner of his mouth twitched. Suddenly grim, Sunny looked away.
I guess. The spell has taught me a great deal of things indeed.
Ananke's smile widened. You're beloved by fate, then I feel at ease. He hid his face, not wanting her to see the dark resentment drowning his eyes. Beloved by fate. Sunny was indeed fated, however, that didn't mean that fate was especially kind to him. It just meant that he was wrapped in its strings like a helpless puppet, doomed to always be at its mercy. In a sense, it meant that he would never know peace, not until he learned how to rip those strings apart.
It's much more like I'm cursed by it.
But then again, wasn't his fate to become defiled, tear his face with his nails and turn into a mad abomination? Wasn't that his future? Sunny shuddered, remembering that frightening possibility.
No way, I would rather die. I will die if this is the only outcome. That stupid theory of mine has to be wrong. The mad prince. I will never become him.
Closing his eyes for a moment, he calmed his wildly beating heart and concentrated on weaving essence strings once again. However, his fingers trembled as he did. By the time the 7 suns touched the surface of the flowing water, the swift ketch reached the second of the 7 houses. Mooring the boat to its pier, they camped for the night on the forlorn island. It looked like a place where life had thrived once, but now that vitality was gone. The children were gone. The parents were gone, and soon enough, the 7 houses would be gone too, swallowed by the eternal currents of the great river. In the morning, Sunny was awoken by the creaking of the windcatchers, after giving Ananke some time to take a walk along the shore and remember the days of her childhood. They left the artificial islands and sailed downstream once again. It took them another day to pass the 3rd house. By then, Ananke's appearance had changed once again. She used to look only slightly older than Sunny and Nephi's in weave, but now it was as if she was of the same age as them, or even younger. By the time the swift ketch reached the 4th house, she seemed to be in her late teens. The mood inside the ketch had turned dark. Looking at the endearing adolescent face of the young priestess, it was impossible to deny that they would have to leave her behind. Soon, the house of parting wasn't that far away anymore. Before they reached it, though, they had to pass by the last 3 of the 7 houses. However, by the time they were supposed to come in view of the 5th, Ananke's expression had turned tense, because the artificial island was nowhere to be found. Sunny and Nephi's had learned a few things about navigating the endlessly flowing waters of the great river, but they were still unsure what distance separated each of the 7 houses from each other. Nevertheless, they quickly understood that something was wrong by looking at Ananke's face. The young priestess was almost always either calm or smiling. At some point, however, a deep frown twisted her soft, adolescent face, and a dark shadow was cast onto her vibrant azure eyes. Sunny was the first to notice. He studied the teenage girl in front of them, then asked what was wrong. Ananke lingered for a few moments. We should have reached the 3rd house by now, my lord. There were 7 artificial islands where the children of Weave spent their childhood, and although the swift ketch was supposed to reach the 5th one, they were actually numbered in reverse order, starting with the house of birth far downstream and ending with the house of youth. So, the 3rd house would have been the 5th they saw, however. It seemed to have disappeared. The young priestess studied the vast expanse of the great river, then mumbled with uncertainty. I guess the mechanisms of the island could have broken down, sending it adrift. I haven't visited here in a long while. Still, the deterioration shouldn't have reached that stage already. Sunny and Nephi's exchanged glances. Rising to her feet, Nephi's looked north.
Could it have been destroyed by an abomination?
Ananke didn't answer for a while. Eventually, she sighed. It's unlikely, but not impossible. maybe that's what happened indeed. The ketch continued to fly downstream, but the mood of its 3 passengers had changed. Not only was there a threat of a powerful nightmare creature stalking the waters somewhere nearby, but the disappearance of one of the islands also meant that the rest of them could be gone. As well, Sunny didn't particularly care about the remaining 2 of the 7 houses, but he was concerned about the lower house of parting, the point where Ananke was supposed to say farewell to them. The young priestess was intending to gift them her ketch, so she needed another vessel in order to return to Weave. There were supposed to be other boats moored at the house of parting, but if the island had been destroyed, they were going to have a problem. The furthest island ship of Weave might not have been destroyed. Even if it was, Sunny could assume the form of the river serpent again, continuing to travel downstream without the ketch, with the crown of twilight. He would be able to sustain that form for longer, but not long enough to reach fallen grace. There were less powerful abominations in the past, though perhaps he and Nephis would be able to come up with a method to stay safe while he replenished his essence. Sunny thought it wasn't too bad. There was nothing to do for now. First, they needed to reach the house of parting and see whether it was still in one piece or not. They continued sailing downstream in grim silence. The 7 suns had already plunged into the great river, suffusing it with a soft glow, when Sunny suddenly stirred and peered into the distance. A few moments later, he pointed forward and said, his voice somber,
I see something there.
Ananke silently moved the steering oar, guiding the ketch in that direction. A dozen minutes later, a dark shape became visible in the iridescent glow of the flowing water. It was massive and strangely shaped, rising above the surface of the river like a mountain without having to say anything. Nephis and Sunny summoned their weapons. Ananke called upon her harpoon. As well, however, they weren't in danger, as the ketch drew closer to the ominous shape. They saw it for what it was. A shattered platform built upon the frame of some leviathan's bones was sticking out of the water, tilted and half-drowned. They first saw one of its sides, overgrown by seaweed and barnacles. It took Sunny some time to realize that he was looking at the bottom of an island ship. Soon, enormous water wheels came into sight, motionless and broken, hanging high in the air. Finally, they went around the edge of the drowning island and saw the side of it that was supposed to be the surface. The bright buildings, those of them that remained above the water, had mostly collapsed into piles of rubble. The gardens had been destroyed, and the tidy streets had turned into a labyrinth of ruins. The tall windcatchers had been shattered, their blades sticking out of the river like torn sails. It was what remained of the 3rd house, looking at the scene of violent devastation. Sunny felt a cold shiver run down his spine.
And what could have destroyed it so thoroughly?
It seemed as though a frenzied titan had been let loose on the floating island. Nephis gripped the hilt of her sword tighter. Her face was motionless, but white sparks were dancing in her eyes.
An abomination.
Ananke remained silent, studying the ruins with a dark expression. Eventually, she shook her head. I don't know, my lady. Let's leave this place as soon as possible. Despite her true age and her youthful appearance, the priestess wasn't a very good liar. Sunny could tell that she was keeping some suspicion to herself. But since Ananke didn't want to speak of it, he decided not to press the issue. For now, he trusted her that much, at least. The young priestess let Nephis take the steering oar and went to the bow of the ketch, still holding her harpoon. The ketch sailed past the ruins of the devastated house, giving them an opportunity to study how utter its destruction had been. None of them said anything, but all 3 looked somber and uneasy. Finally, they left the drowning island behind and continued moving with the current of the great river. An hour passed in tense silence. Then another, despite Sunny's fears. No monstrous dweller of the depths attacked the small ketch. After a while, the first of the 7 suns appeared from beneath the waters. The impenetrable darkness released its hold upon the sky, and a new day came, as bright and beautiful as all the rest of them. However, there was something different about this one. When all 7 suns had risen from the water, Sunny noticed that far ahead of them in the distance, the darkness still remained. It veiled the northern horizon like a wall, connecting the surface of the great river to the sky. Ananke was staring at the distant wall of darkness, too, her youthful face pale. He scowled.
Some ancient abomination manifesting its power, a defiled.
The young priestess pursed her lips, then slowly shook her head. "No, my lord, it's much worse. It's a storm." Her melodious voice sounded solemn as she spoke of a time storm. The ominous words hung in the air, as foreboding as the wall of darkness veiling the sky far in the distance. Sunny and Nephis looked at Ananke, wary because of her somber expression. This was the first time either of them had seen the young priestess show signs of despondence. The three of them must have made for a funny sight, two battle-hardened warriors staring at a teenage girl, waiting for her guidance. Sunny frowned.
"A time storm."
Ananke nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord, I've told you before that time can be unpredictable on the Great River. There are places where it turns stale and unmoving, great whirlpools that nothing can ever escape, clashing currents and deadly tides of all kinds. A time storm is one of the most dangerous anomalies one can encounter." Her youthful face darkened. It's a wandering disaster that twists and rips time apart, containing within itself absolute chaos. These storms originate from the span of the great river that corresponds to the final days of the Doom War, when the last cataclysmic battles between the demons and the gods were fought, and when both sides perished. They usually don't reach that far upstream. I am sorry. Nephis shook her head.
You don't need to be sorry, Ananke. It's not your fault. However, how do we escape it?
The young priestess lingered for a few moments, then said quietly, "I am not sure that we can." She uttered several words, easily overpowering Neph's shaping. The wind that had been filling the sails of the ketch disappeared, and a moment later, a powerful gale crushed into the wooden boat, making it creak. This one wasn't summoned by anyone, much worse. It was blowing from downstream, pushing their hair back, which meant that the dark wall devouring the horizon was traveling in their direction. At least a normal storm would. Judging by Ananke's expression, a time storm behaved the same. Sunny uttered a silent curse. He asked if they could outrun it. The young priestess swiftly moved to the side of the ketch and looked down at the clear water flowing past the polished wood. A few moments later, she gritted her teeth. "I don't think so, my lord. We are already caught in its outer reaches." It was only then that Sunny noticed that the current of the great river seemed to have grown much stronger. It was hard to tell when the ketch was flying forward at full speed, but now that it slowed down and was about to come to a halt, the changes were apparent even for an outsider like himself. The wind was chasing the storm in their direction, while the current was pulling them into the storm. It was like a trap. Sunny said, "Damn it." Ananke stared at the approaching wall of the storm with a dark expression. A few moments later, she took a deep breath and forced out a smile. Sunny asked what they should do. "We will just have to brave it then, my lord and lady." Sunny and Nephis stared at the teenage girl with stumped expressions. Hadn't she said that a time storm was a roving mass of chaotic time, wild and distorted enough to be absolutely deadly? The third house had been much larger and infinitely more robust than their small ketch, but it was utterly destroyed. How the hell were they supposed to survive something like that? The young priestess shook her head. It's not as bad as it sounds. I am a transcendent, after all. We, the followers of Weaver, had to pass through the tumultuous region from where these storms originate on our way upstream, so we know a thing or two about how to endure them." Her voice sounded confident, but the look in her eyes was anything but. Noticing their doubt, Ananke sighed. "I am reasonably certain that I can keep this small ketch from being torn apart. It's lucky, actually, that our vessel isn't too large, however." She stared at the wall of darkness that had already drawn closer in the few minutes they were talking, and grew solemn. "It's very important that none of us touches the water or becomes separated from the ketch. This storm front we see is only the aftereffect of the true disaster. The real horror lies beneath the waves, in the depths of water. No one can survive being pulled down by the raging currents of broken time. If you fall into the river, you'll never come back." Sunny grimaced. His hope of being able to salvage the situation by turning into the river serpent had just been crushed. Now, his only choice was to trust Ananke to see them through the disaster. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, but... Sunny suddenly remembered traversing the dark sea of the forgotten shore on the shoulder of the walking colossus. There had been a storm then, too, and a harrowing creature hiding within the storm. His expression crumbled.
There are no ancient abominations hiding in that wall of darkness, are there?
Ananke looked at him with surprise, then shook her head with a smile. No, my lord, even the defiled can't survive the broken time. They avoid these storms just as we do. Sunny sighed and looked downstream with a bleak face. After a while, he asked in a dull voice,
We should prepare for a rocky ride, then.
The young priestess nodded. She agreed that he was wise. He wasn't even in the mood to celebrate getting another praise, shaking his head. Sunny started stretching his body, then froze, realizing how senseless his actions were. They weren't preparing for a battle. Sharp swords and sturdy armor weren't going to help them survive the storm, and neither would their combat skills. Sighing again, he asked,
What exactly do we need to do?
With no time to waste, Ananke directed them on how to help her prepare the ketch for braving the storm. She tried to sound calm, but hints of urgency found their way into her voice. The preparations didn't take long. They lowered the sails, then folded them neatly. As it turned out, both masts of the ketch could be taken down as well after dismantling them. Everything was either stored under the deck of the wooden boat or fastened tightly in place. 10 minutes later, nothing that could be easily torn or broken by the wind remained. The ketch turned from a sailboat into a simple and barren vessel, seemingly too small to survive a terrible storm, but also solid enough to look like it. Maybe could. The three of them stood on the empty deck, looking north. The wall of darkness was approaching. As the winds turned violent and the surface of the great river grew restless, Ananke gave them a few simple instructions. There wasn't much to say, really. She would be responsible for steering the ketch, protecting it against the ravages of distorted time, and preventing it from turning over, while they had to scoop up the water that would inevitably get inside and throw it back overboard. The three of them also used sturdy ropes to tie themselves to the ketch. If the boat did overturn, hopefully, they wouldn't be pulled into the depths of the underwater storm immediately. Sunny wasn't sure what would happen if Ananke failed to keep their boat above the waves, though, so he didn't feel too hopeful. He told them to prepare themselves. The voice of the young priestess was grave, which created a strange dissonance with her adolescent appearance. Once we enter the storm, we won't be free of it for several days. It'll be hard to endure the strain. Even for ascended like you, my lord and lady, conserve your stamina and essence, too. She lingered for a few moments, and then added quietly, All kinds of things can happen, but fate will guide us. Have faith. Sunny gritted his teeth. If there was one thing he didn't have and never wished to possess, it was faith. The only thing he believed in was the strength of his arms and the resilience of his spirit. But Ananke was different. If faith in Weaver could help her cope with the cruel truth of the world, then he didn't have the heart to diminish it with his words, so he remained silent. He said they would survive this. Looking at the wooden dipper he had been given, Sunny sighed. Who knew that he would miss traveling inside the giant alloy coffins of the House of Night one day? The wall of darkness, meanwhile, was approaching. The winds were growing more and more violent, their howls drowning out all other sounds. The current of the great river had turned fast and erratic, carrying the ketch forward with frightening speed. Tall waves rose and fell, and the wooden boat rose and fell with them, strong impacts reverberating through his bones. Several days of this. Sunny finally understood why Ananke had said that enduring the storm wouldn't be easy even for the inhumanly strong and resilient ascended like them. Plus, it wasn't a mundane storm, either. Eventually, the ketch plunged into a thick mist. A few moments before it did, the light of the seven suns suddenly grew strange and distorted, as if someone had covered the sky with a muddy prism. Sunny's hair stood on end. He experienced a very eerie and uncomfortable sensation. A sensation of the laws of the world coming undone around him. Maybe time, which had always been a constant, didn't feel solid and reliable anymore. Instead, it was wild and chaotic, playing strange games with his perception. Even the shadows surrounding him were fragmented and twisted, stretched endlessly or moving in an impossible manner. It was rather maddening. He felt nauseated. And apart from this bizarre sense of wrongness, The ketch was being thrown around like a toy by the waves. His body was being jerked from side to side, up and down, experiencing moments of weightlessness and rough impacts. The winds were battering him, throwing streams of water at his face. The roaring of the storm was deafening, blinded by the furiously swirling mist and the drops of water flying into his eyes. Sonny instantly felt miserable and afraid. People had always been frightened in the face of raging nature. But here, it wasn't even nature. Instead, the storm surrounding them was entirely unnatural. It was just as harrowing still. And it was only growing stronger. They were only at the outer boundary of the unnatural disaster, as Sonny wondered how they were going to survive several days of this torture, if the ketch wasn't destroyed sooner. At that, he heard Ananke through the cacophony of the raging storm. The names she had spoken were unfamiliar, and judging by the strain in her voice, they weren't something the young priestess could easily use, or invoked often. Nevertheless, after she spoke these words, the nauseating distortion of the time storm seemed to have subsided a little. The ketch was still climbing the tall waves and plummeting from them, and the winds were still as violent as they had been a moment before, but the physical hardship of enduring their ruthless assault was at least tolerable. It was as though an invisible bubble of more stable time appeared around the small ketch. Keeping the worst of the chaos away, Sonny turned his head to look at the young priestess. Ananke was holding the steering oar with both hands, looking into the mist with a focused expression. Her youthful face was pale, but her azure eyes were full of stalwart determination. She controlled the ketch with a skill born from hundreds of years of living on the great river, somehow guiding it through the towering waves and chaotic currents. Then, he glanced at Nephis. Her eyes were burning with white flame, the light fabric of her tunic fluttering in the wind. Finally, Sonny looked down and let out a heavy breath. Bending down, he scooped up the first portion of water and tossed it into the mist. His hand trembled for a moment. Were they really going to live through this? Sonny had lived through a great deal of things, many of which no one had any business surviving. He had often imagined his death, as well, in his imagination. That death always came at the hand of a powerful nightmare creature, or a similarly powerful human. Sometimes, he imagined dying of old age in a comfortable bed. Too, one thing Sonny very rarely imagined, if ever, was being killed by a dumb, mindless force of nature. Perhaps it was vain, considering the kinds of environments he often ended up in, but still, he was unwilling to succumb to something so senseless.
I survived a fight with a great beast, damn it.
Was he going to die because of a weird storm? Sonny thought like hell he would, not to mention that there were the lives of Nephis and Ananke to consider. Too, encouraging himself like this, Sonny endured another wave and scooped more water from the wet deck. The mist swirled and boiled around them, and the small ketch was being pulled deeper and deeper into the storm. The time storm raged all around them. The current of the great river, which had always been calm and constant, turned into a furious tide, being carried and tossed around by it. The ketch flew forward with terrible speed. Tall waves rose and fell, and hurricane winds howled like frenzied beasts. Everything around them was drowning in a boiling fog, blinded by it, deafened by the roaring thunderclaps. The three of them had lost all sense of time and direction. There was only the feeling of the wet deck beneath their feet, the soaring and plummeting of the wooden boat, and the physical strain of enduring the cataclysmic fury of the storm. Faced with its inconceivable wrath, Sonny couldn't help but feel how tiny and insignificant he was in the face of the unnatural disaster. And that was with Ananke holding the worst of it at bay. As well, the eerie, deeply distressing feeling of the immutable laws of the world turning vague and volatile was still there. Muted but indescribably oppressive, he felt sickened, both physically and mentally. It was as if the solid foundation of his very being had suddenly been replaced by shifting quicksand, leaving him shaking and unstable. Perhaps that was what madness felt like.
Damnation.
Steeling his heart, Sonny tried to ignore the appalling sensation and concentrated on his task, scooping up the water that had been thrown into the ketch by the storm and tossing it overboard. There was a lot of it, but he and Nephis could still keep up. It was just that this simple task had turned out to be much more demanding than he expected. Simply existing in the wildly rocking boat was already an exercise in endurance. considering the dire speed of the current and the height of the waves. It felt as though some demented giant was playing catch with their bodies, throwing them high up and then slamming them down with ferocious power. Keeping his balance wasn't only tiring, but also difficult. Every muscle in his body was under strain, seemingly at all times. The movements of the jerking ketch were chaotic and impossible to predict. However, failing to follow them was tantamount to death. If Sonny wasn't careful and failed to continuously adjust to the constant changes, he would be thrown down on the deck, or worse yet, tossed overboard into the seething water, and he had to do more than simply exist. He had to move, scoop up water, and throw it back into the raging river. Of course, there were more efficient ways of accomplishing that task. He could do more and do it better with the help of shadow manifestation. But their struggle against the storm was going to be an arduous marathon, not a sprint. Currently, he felt only slightly tired. That tiredness was going to turn into a crippling exhaustion sooner rather than later. Then, he was going to have to burn through his essence to keep his battered body moving, hoping against all hope that his reserves were deep enough. Wasting it on frivolous things would have been a short-sighted decision. Sonny admitted he was wrong. Before they plunged into the storm, Sonny had noted that it wasn't a battle, but it was. It was just as physically straining, just as violent, and just as deadly. The difference was that he couldn't remember a battle that had lasted for many days without ever allowing the fighters to rest and breathe for even a minute. How dreadful would that be? At least the enemy was a mindless force of nature, an enemy like that didn't require him to think too much, thus draining his mental powers. While arduous and exhausting, his task wasn't too far from being mechanical. Sonny still had to remain focused and actively pay attention to the motions of the ketch. But he didn't have to think, analyze the situation, and come up with lethal schemes. Same went for Nephis. Ananke, however. Her task was much more difficult than theirs. Not only did the priestess have to maintain the mystical protections around the ketch, she was also responsible for steering it. The small boat would have already overturned a dozen times if not for the swift and precise judgment of their guide. Sonny looked back at the small figure of the young girl who was holding the steering oar firmly. Peering into the mist, her face was pale, but her eyes were brimming with focused resolve. He was worried about her. He was worried about a great deal of things. For example, about the fact that they were barely a few hours into the storm, with multiple days of this hell still remaining before the ketch escaped it, if nothing unexpected happened. Sonny told himself one step at a time, one step at a time, one wave at a time, one thunderclap at a time. That was how they were going to survive the time storm. That was how Sonny and Nephis were going to survive the third nightmare, as well, and after that. Sonny didn't have even the slightest idea what was going to happen after, if he became a saint, not only to him, but also to humanity itself. The great clans were going to continue their war. The waking world would continue to crumble. The nightmare spell would continue to pull them all deeper and deeper into the mysterious machinations of the demon of fate.
Let's survive the damned storm first.
Cursing under his breath, he bent his knees to lessen the impact of the wooden deck hitting his feet, endured the ketch plummeting from the crest of a tall wave to crash violently into the water, then hurriedly threw several scoops of foaming water over the side of the boat. A few steps away, Nephis was doing the same. The world seemed to be coming undone all around them, separated from the abyss of broken time only by the thin deck of a wooden boat. They sailed through the raging mist,